And on behalf of Dean Pedro Oliveira, I would like to welcome you all to be here today for our workshop on employer market power. And before we get started and talk a little more about the workshop, perhaps I can tell you a little bit about the Institute. So we're about 1 year old. And what do we do? Well, the purpose of the Public Policy Institute is, as the name suggests, to improve public policy in a way that is really impactful. In other words, there are many think tanks devoted to public policy. We would like to be more than that. We would like to actually move the needle of public policy, to have an impact, to have influence, to change the way things are done. But to do so in a way that it's not improvised, as unfortunately frequently public policy is, but is rather founded on rigorous research, much of which, of course, will be academic research. And today will be an example of that. And I hope you will agree that it's an important step towards well-informed public policy. But we do research, we do a variety of activities that engage society and the real world, in particular policymakers. We also do a variety of activities that engage students and get them interested in matters related to public policy. So just to give a few examples, this year we had our first national public policy debate competition, which brought together students from many different universities, many different majors, from law to engineering to medicine to economics, to debate public policy issues and to learn the art and the science of discussing in a civil manner important and difficult, often difficult points and propositions of public policy. In fact, much of the polarization we see in our world is the result of public policy questions that are difficult. But difficult as they are, they must be discussed. And that's what we try to do in here. And that's one of the goals that this debate competition had. But we've also organized a variety of events like this one. And we have a lot planned for the near future. In December, for example, we'll have our first so-called policy workshop. It's an event, it's not an academic event, even though it includes many academics. And the goal is to actually come up with very specific public policy proposals that can be actionable. In this particular case, we'll have a policy workshop on innovation and productivity, very much motivated by the Draghi report, which, if you read it, has a very simple diagnosis that Europe seems to be falling behind the United States and perhaps even China on matters related to innovation and productivity. Why? What can we do about it? How can public policy influence that? So that'll be one of the main events we'll have. We'll have our second edition of our debate competition. And I encourage you all, if you know students, university students who might be interested in that, the deadline is approaching. So we very much look forward to applications to that debate competition. As a sweetener, we have 10,000 euros of prize money. So not bad for a student to get some extra cash. So that's another additional incentive. And we'll have quite a number of other activities. I encourage you to follow our LinkedIn page, which has lots of information about what we're doing, or just to reach out to us if you're interested in knowing more about the NOVA SBE Public Policy Institute. So let's get back to today's workshop. And before continuing, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank everyone who has contributed to putting it together, many of whom are here in the back. But in particular, I'd like to mention Carmen Coutinho and Lillian Lemon, two key players in our NPPI team, for having putting this together. And I'm very glad to see that we're getting off to a good start. So what is today's workshop about? Employer market power. Unless you've been under a rock for the past 50 years, workers' conditions have not gotten better in the past few decades. There are many ways of measuring that. I'll tell you a little bit about that in half an hour. But generally speaking, things are not getting better for labor, for workers in general. And today we're going to talk about one specific dimension of that. and that is employer market power. What do I mean by that? What do I mean is that frequently workers have very few employers to choose from. And in many industries and in many countries, that number is going down. So increasingly, employment is becoming concentrated on fewer employers. Does that matter? Does that have any implications for workers? Does that have any implications for firms, for society as a general? That's why we're here today. That's the topic of today's workshop, and I'm so glad that we have a very fine lineup of speakers, myself excluded. But in particular, we're going to get off to a great start with literally one of the world's leading scholars on the topic, and it is a great privilege for us to listen from her today. But for that, and without further ado, I will ask Pedro Martins, the Deputy Director of Nova SBE's Public Policy Institute, to introduce her. I don't know if we're doing that a little bit ahead of time or not, but we'll find out. But she will. Should I wait for a few more minutes, or do you want to talk about? You'll think about it. Okay, so we're going to wait for a few minutes before. Unfortunately, Iona Martinescu is unable to be with us here today, but we agreed that she would deliver her presentation remotely, and we're just waiting for her to log on. So just to give you an idea, a little bit of a preview, we'll have a first keynote speech by Iona Martinescu, and that will be followed by two presentations of two research works sponsored by NPPI on the topic of today's talk. I'll be presenting one of them, and Pedro will be presenting another one, and they will be discussed for a few minutes by two discussants that generously agreed to read our papers and talk about them on short notice, and I appreciate that effort. Then we'll have a second keynote speech by Professor Eric Posner from the University of Chicago, who has been writing precisely on this topic, and very much look forward to that as well. And after a break, we'll conclude with a panel, which will combine, two approaches to the issues, I should say, of labor and competition policy, labor policy and competition policy. And we'll have a senior staff member of the Portuguese Competition Authority, which will take on the competition policy perspective and approach to issues of labor market power. And unfortunately, one of the panelists on this panel is stuck at an airport somewhere in Europe, I understand. But fortunately, Pedro Martins has agreed to step in and talk about labor policy issues as they relate to employer market power. And so that'll be a wonderful panel moderated by Isabel Patricio from ECHO. So that's the plan for today. And at this moment, like I said, we're just waiting for Ioana to log on online. So as we wait for her, and since we have a few minutes, if there are any questions or comments you might have regarding NPPI, the Institute, and what we do or whatnot, this might be a good opportunity to talk about that, or any other question you might have. Otherwise, we'll just wait for the connection to be made. It's always a technical problem. Yes? You may need a microphone. Is that the only one?
No, I have one here.
Oh, there's another one here. The reason why we need a microphone throughout the proceedings is not that I cannot hear you, is that as the event is being streamed, if you're not being mic'd, you're not being heard. So I know it's a bit of a hassle to have to wait for a microphone, but today I would like us to do that. It's important.
Yes, thank you, Luis, for the presentation of the NPP and what we're going to see today. I was wondering which are the areas that the NPP NPPI actually is focusing about in terms of research, in terms of advancing the policy frontier?
Right. So that's a good question, because if you think about, pretty much everything is public policy. So everything in the world is somehow somewhat related to public policy. And so unless we are to narrow things in some way, we would be all over the place. And so what we've done, we've established a few priorities of areas that we would like to focus our research. They've evolved a little bit over the past months, I would say. But currently, productivity, which is, by the way, the topic for our December workshop, is a topic. In fact, we are funded by the Haddad Productivity Lab, funded by the Haddad Foundation. So that's certainly one aspect. Issues related to inequality are important. We'll have a workshop in July of 2026. I'm very excited about that, on rethinking early childhood, which is going to focus on what on earth is happening in the first 3 years of life that makes inequality already being very, very marked at that age. It's not a trivial question as it happens, and our workshop will focus precisely on that. We are interested in issues related to immigration and housing, which are very important in Portugal right now, but in many, many other countries throughout the world as well. We are interested as well in issues related to tax reform and social security reform, which, again, in many European countries, in Portugal included, are of fundamental importance at a time when demographic trends are creating a sort of a time bomb when it comes to the tax system and social security. So these are some of the areas that we've been focused on in recent years. Oh, I should add one that is on the radar, and stay tuned. So issues related to energy and sustainability, which we also believe are quite important for European economies right now. So we're currently planning on possibly organizing also a policy workshop on that in the future. So these are, I would say, the main areas. I hope I haven't forgotten any of those. And by the way, if you are interested in doing research or in any way being associated with the Institute, we're very happy to gather those manifestations of interest, and there's always something that can be done and where you can help. Okay. Any signs from Joanna? Okay, we have her online. That's wonderful. It means that we can get started. And so I'll just wait for Pedro to be ready. Pedro knows our first speaker well, and so I thought he would be the right person to introduce her. Are we ready?
She's online. There are a few technical issues in terms of sound availability, so I'm not sure if she can follow us. But I can introduce her to the group in any case. So I think she will be about to join us. She's already online. So once again, welcome to this event. It's great to see so many of you in this event about this important topic of labor market power. Joanna, we can see you. Can you hear us?
Hi, yes, I can hear you.
Yes, very good. So right on time, Luis Cabral has just concluded his introduction with respect to the goal of our workshop. And I was about to start with a brief introduction about yourself. So it's really a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity and to have Joanna with us here at Nova School of Business and Economics. A little far away, physically speaking, but very close to our minds from an intellectual standpoint. So, Joanna, you have a very rich CV. Let me just highlight a few major bullet points. So, Joanna is an associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania with the School of Public Policy. She's also a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. She's a leading contributor to labor economics, to antitrust issues, and more recently to issues regarding artificial intelligence. Joanne has published in leading journals, and perhaps I would highlight the Review of Economic Studies and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. I very much like your paper in the review, where you show that labor market concentration can have a huge role in terms of understanding what are the employment effects of minimum wages. Depending on the character, on the nature of local labor markets, minimum wages can have dramatically different effects, ranging from positive effects to negative effects. So I think this is a fantastic finding that can help a lot in terms of our understanding of this major labor market institution that is the minimum wage. On top of all her academic contributions, Joanna has also a very significant policy contribution. She has delivered testimonials to the US Congress. She has been the principal economist with the antitrust division of the Department of Justice in the US. So this is a very significant contribution. She highlighted the role of labor markets in antitrust cases, which of course is a very, very big deal, particularly from the perspective of the United States. More recently, on top of all this, she has also joined as an economic consultant to Anthropic. So as you know, Anthropic is a leading contributor to the new developments in large language models, in particular the Claude large language model, which has been supported by Google and Amazon. So, Joanna, fantastic to have you with us. We have about 20 minutes. So perhaps we could leave a little time for questions and answers at the end, depending on how things go. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, and I give you the floor.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody. I'm really happy to be here, and I apologize for my voice. I'm a little bit congested. But here we go. And because we have a limited amount of time, I'm gonna, go a little quickly over some of the slides. But we're gonna get the key points. So again, thanks for having me. So we're going to talk here about monopsony in the labor market and why it matters. And, based on, we're going to ask the question, how does competition influence wages and why does it matter for labor market outcomes? So we're going to profit at others' expense. So this markdown that I advocate for as a summary statistic for monopsony power, it summarizes outcomes, but not the competitive process. It doesn't capture all dimensions of labor market dynamics or strategic interaction, but it's still a concise measure of firms' ability to suppress wages below workers' marginal contributions. So let's talk about the theory. What are the sources of monopsony power? One of the big ones is labor market concentration, and the core idea there is that there are few employers. So if there's few employers, there's few options, and you have wage below the marginal revenue product. Another reason for monopsony power is heterogeneous jobs or job differentiation. So this means if you have job differentiation, workers have limited choices of jobs that are substitutes. And so this leads again to monopsony power. Even if there's infinitely many jobs, so it's not a problem that there's few employers. If the jobs are differentiated, only some of the jobs are relevant to workers. So that's a second channel. And the third channel is search frictions. And so here the idea is that there's limited shopping amount. So even if there's infinitely many employers and all the jobs are the same, nevertheless, it takes time for workers to locate a job. And on top of that, employers must also accept their applications. So all this leads to friction, so that at any particular point in time, in many standard models, the worker is only negotiating with one firm. And that gives this firm market power for the search frictions. And so that's another reason for monopsony power. And this is modeled through the matching function. So to summarize then, we have three core reasons for monopsony power that are, you can see as deviations from perfect competition. In the first model, oligopsony model, you have a finite number of firms with strategic interactions. The determinants of the markdown in this model are going to be the labor market concentration and the labor supply elasticity to the market. The second case is differentiated jobs. And so here, the key deviation is heterogeneous preferences and why firms can pay less because this job is better than the next best alternative. The jobs are differentiated. Here, the core parameter that determines monopsony power is the job substitutability from the point of view of workers. So how substitutable are jobs with each other? Additionally, new extensions can also combine this mechanism with labor market concentration and the labor supply elasticity to the market. Third, there is search and matching. That's a third source of monopsony power. So here the issue is search frictions. And the key reason why firms can pay less is because firms cannot meet all jobs at the same time. So here the fundamental determinants of the markdown are the outside option, the matching function, the shape of the matching function. And again, the outside option is something like, for example, unemployment benefits is one of the things that would go into the outside option, and the bargaining power if we have a bargaining model. However, people have also recently added the idea of labor market concentration also in these kinds of models. So obviously, you could have theoretical and empirical setups where you combine two or more of these mechanisms, but these are the core mechanisms from the literature that lead to markdown or wages being below workers' marginal revenue product. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this detailed discussion of models, but if you're interested in that, please check out our chapter in the Handbook of Labor Economics. And just to say that across different models, you can derive, and I'm going to go to this table, which is from our Handbook of Labor Economics chapter. So across these different models, you can derive the markdown. And remember, the markdown here is defined as the gap between marginal revenue product and the wage scaled by the wage. So, that's the measurement I'm taking here. So in oligopsony, it has a very nice formula, which is that the firm level markdown is the firm share divided by the labor supply elasticity to the market. And if you take the average markdown in the market, here comes the HHI, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index or concentration, divided by the elasticity of labor supply to the market. And you can see then we go to differentiated jobs. And here, again, you can have differentiated jobs with oligopsony, where, again, HHI is going to matter. I put the terms that are concentration-like in red. And finally, in the search model, so this is one particular formulation of the search model, you can see that the average markdown in the market depends on this red term here, which is lambda over delta. And this lambda over delta is a term that reflects the average number of firms that are competing for the worker. You could see it like this, because lambda is the job offer arrival rate per period, how many jobs am I getting, and delta is the job separation rate. So if I have a job, how likely is it that I'm going to lose this job? So that really reflects competition for workers, this term as well within the search and matching framework. So the bottom line of this is that the exact formula obviously differs with the type of model, but you typically have a term that reflects competition for workers, which could be either the HHI or, in the case of search and matching model, something that has to do with the job offer arrival rate relative to the job separation rate. So here I'm going to skip over this and talk to you a little bit about the empirical estimates of the markdown. So there are three key empirical approaches to markdown estimation. Either you can have a reduced form elasticity of labor supply estimation that uses quasi-experimental variation. And you've seen from the prior discussion of the model that the elasticity of labor supply is a key determinant of the markdown. You can have structural estimation, often used in industrial organization or IO, or the production function approach, which also is often used in IO, but uses a different approach to this estimation. So this table summarizes different papers that estimate the elasticity of labor supply and the markdown. So if you look at the first column is the firm level elasticity. It varies, of course, across studies, but it's often in the ballpark of 2 to 5 is not uncommon. And then if you look at the markdowns, markdowns that are reported are somewhere between 20% and 40%, which means that workers' marginal revenue product is about, let's say if it's 20%, that would mean the workers' marginal revenue product is 20% higher than their wage. I repeat, 20% markdown here means workers' productivity is 20% higher than what they're getting paid. Next up, we're looking at studies using structural estimation to get at this estimation of the markdown. So this includes my own study with Jose Azar and Steve Berry, where we use job application data from careerbuilder.com in the US. And we allow workers to apply to any job in the economy, but with a nested logit structure where workers are assigned to a particular occupation by commuting zone market. And then we can model how likely they are to apply elsewhere. So based on this structure, we estimate a firm level elasticity of 4.8 and a market level elasticity of 0.5. By the way, from the model, it makes the market level elasticity should be smaller because that is the elasticity of labor supply to the whole market. Like let's say nursing in Philadelphia, where I live, nursing in Philadelphia, that's the whole market. Whereas the firm level elasticity might be the elasticity of labor supply to the University of Pennsylvania hospital. I work at University of Pennsylvania, so that when we have a hospital, so then you can do the firm level elasticity. And so if you look at the implied markdown, in our study is 21%. So that means that workers are 21% more productive than the wages that they're getting paid. And if you look at other studies using related strategies, you can see that they come up with very similar markdown estimates in the ballpark of about 20%. And finally, this last table looks at a series of different estimation and identification strategies. But I do want to point out for everybody the production function approach, which is the bottom 3 studies in this table. This approach is very interesting because it really complements some of the studies we've seen before, in the sense that instead of trying to look at worker behavior, so the worker side predominantly, and what's the elasticity of labor supply, here it's squarely focusing on the firm side, so that you're using firm level data to directly estimate essentially the MRPL. And so that's a different way of getting at the markdown, trying to estimate the marginal revenue product of labor through a production function approach. So by literally, trying to understand how firms produce and how much labor contributes. So of course, there's a lot of technicalities involved in that, but that's the basic idea. So if you do it this way, and that's also the bottom 3 studies, again, you can see a range of markdowns. So the first study looks at US manufacturing and finds a markdown of 53%, which is higher than what we discussed before, but this is only manufacturing, and the other studies were across a number of different sectors. And then the bottom 2 are looking at other countries, including Germany, China, India, and you can see markdowns between roughly 20–40%. So it's very reassuring that, while of course the numbers are not the same for many reasons, this approach that takes the firm level production function and tries to directly get at the markdown through that channel finds ballpark similar markdown estimates to other studies that rely more on worker behavior to get at the markdown. So to summarize then, the empirical estimates of the markdown in the literature show typically, there are estimates that are outside this bound, but typically the markdown is between 15% and 50%, meaning that workers' productivity is 15 to 50% greater than their current wage. So now let me briefly talk about monopsony and policy. So this table comes from our annual review of economics paper that focuses very much on policy. And you can see here that we discuss a broad range of policies where labor market competition is of interest, including antitrust policy, barriers to switching job, and direct intervention to increase job quality. And thankfully, Pedro already summarized my study for the minimum wage. So that is one important area of research, and there's a lot of research also on non-competes and mergers. But again, in the interest of time, I'm going to zoom ahead and just briefly discuss antitrust policy in the US and beyond. So as Pedro mentioned, I was a principal economist at the Department of Justice in the US, Department of Justice Antitrust Division. And as part of this role, I've been overseeing all the casework, so all of the cases that came to the department, including labor cases. And during the time that I was there, the DOJ, for the first time, successfully blocked a merger of publishers based on labor monopsony, where the argument was that the merger of large publishers was going to decrease authors' pay. Also, while I was there, we included labor markets explicitly in the merger guidelines. In particular, it was made clear that antitrust agencies will evaluate the impact on labor or workers as a standalone basis to challenge a merger, meaning that they don't need to look at product market effects. It's enough that the merger has anti-competitive effects in the labor market. So now, of course, we have a new administration, and I will mention that there is relative continuity on labor antitrust at the DOJ and the FTC in the US, and that moreover, labor antitrust enforcement is strong across the world, including, for example, in Portugal, where the competition authority has brought multiple cases against no poaching and wage fixing agreements. So let me conclude. We've seen that you have finite labor supply elasticities, labor market concentration, job differentiation, and surge friction. All of these lead to monopsony power in the labor market. We have robust empirical evidence across sectors, settings, and time showing that workers' productivity is 15 to 50% higher than their wage. Policy matters. We've seen antitrust policy with merger guidelines, regulation of non-competes, which I haven't had time to touch upon, but happy to answer any question, the minimum wage, and lines of enforcement around the world where labor antitrust is gaining momentum. And even in the US, while there's many changes across administration, labor antitrust has bipartisan roots and momentum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joanna. Fantastic tour de force over all these incredibly important topics. If you can stay with us for a couple of additional minutes, perhaps.
Absolutely.
That is great. Thank you very much. I'm wondering if there are any questions from the audience. Yes, 2 questions. Maybe we can collect them. Okay, Gustav first.
Hi, thanks a lot for the presentation, Joanna. I wanted to ask about heterogeneous effects. So how does the monopsony power affect workers who are less productive and workers who are more productive? So workers who are closer to minimum wage, for example, and workers who are highly skilled.
We'll go for the second question, Rodrigo.
Hi, Joanna. Thank you very much for this great presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how public policy can influence the search frictions and the amenities part of monopsony, because there are some recent papers that talk a lot about how firm granularity and firm size can impact monopsony, and that part of public policy and antitrust. I think we can easily see the connection, but search frictions, amenities, and job preferences also affect that, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how public policy could tackle those. Thank you.
Any further questions, Luis?
What is the current score in terms of DOJ cases regarding monopsony power, both during the Biden administration and currently in the Trump administration? Any wins, any losses, and what are the prospects?
Thank you. So I'm going to try to tackle these questions in turn. So first, about the impact of monopsony power on low versus high-skilled workers. There's a number of papers that have looked at the variation in markdowns or concentration, etc., by education, which is a proxy for that. And I will say that generally, there isn't a clear pattern, as in necessarily lower skilled workers have a higher markdown or the other way around. In fact, in our study with Jose Azan, Steve Berry, we find that markdowns are fairly similar across educational categories. So in that sense, this is a quote-unquote popular topic. Everybody is affected. In fact, there is a paper to many of us will be relevant, estimating monopsony power of universities over professors, and it's quite substantial. In fact, it's more substantial in this case for the more senior professors. So that's an interesting topic. So secondly, a public policy that influences search frictions and amenities. So I think the amenities side, that's a complicated one, because at some level, the amenities are things that workers really value. So the fact that there's different amenities that different workers value isn't all in all, welfare reducing. In fact, it's nice to have different jobs that satisfy different preferences. So I think that question is pretty complicated, and it's still frontier to try to understand how it intersects with monopsony power and policy. I think search frictions are more straightforward thing, because there's always, ever since we've had search and matching models, there's an understanding that we ideally want to reduce search frictions, because that generally increases efficiency in the market. But I think what this perspective adds is that you could also see it as increasing competition for labor, and that's how it can increase wages. So what might that mean? Promoting avenues for example, job search assistance and things of this sort that could allow workers to find jobs more effectively. And finally, and by the way, sorry, wink, wink, you could use AI to do that. And in fact, I'm aware of a project where people are using AI to better understand workers' preferences. And so this intersects with this fundamental amenity issue. People have complex preferences, but with using LLMs, large language models, you could potentially more easily elicit people's preferences and understand what jobs, would fit best, and thereby alleviating some of the matching frictions from, people not necessarily being able to locate the right job. So I think that there's promise, for example, in that area, and potentially public employment services could avail themselves of some of this technology, and use it to benefit job seekers. And finally, regarding the scorecard with the DOJ, as with any newer area of enforcement, there's been some wins, some losses. So I mentioned the merger case where we've been successful. Very recently, they've been also successful in a case in the healthcare industry against no poaching and wage fixing. But that was the first time they succeeded. After bringing many unsuccessful cases against no poach and wage fixing agreement, and part of why this area is difficult is because these are criminal cases. So the jury has to agree that this was a crime, and because this is a bit new and people aren't necessarily familiar, they may think that, agreeing not to hire each other's workers, doesn't amount to something that is a crime. Even though according to the antitrust laws, it is a crime. So I think that's part of what's going on. And then we've also had in the US an interesting episode around the regulation of non-competition agreements. So the FTC, during the Biden administration, issued a new rule that would essentially ban all non-competition agreements. This rule was challenged in court and received several adverse decisions. And the FTC appealed, but very recently they gave up. So they just decided to not have the rule. At the same time, and that's why I think it's so interesting, and the continuity is that they started new cases going after excessive non-competes, because the antitrust authorities do have the tools to, especially the FTC, because this can be considered an unfair method of competition. So a non-compete that is too aggressive severely limits competition, and they can go after that as part of the enforcement strategy. So therefore, instead of having a blanket ban on most non-competes, they are enforcing against those that are, clearly anti-competitive, and they're continuing to do that. So I think it's really interesting to understand that as a policymaker, you have a number of different tools between regulation, enforcement, as well as enforcement priorities. And, persistence can pay, as we've seen in the case of the enforcements against no poaching agreements. So I hope that gives you a sense of, what's going on in the policy world.
Thank you so much, Joanna. I think your talk was the perfect way to kickstart our workshop. I'm not sure if you'll be able to stay with us for at least a little longer. In any case, we very much look forward to continuing this discussion. Thank you so much once again. Very good. So without further ado, I would give the floor back to Luis for our second presentation of the day. Will we use this one? Or this one is working, I understand.
Oh. So I'll use this microphone. Can you hear me? Great. Next I will introduce myself, because I'll be the next speaker. So I will be talking about one of the research projects we're working on in here. As soon as the slides are up, I'll introduce the set of co-authors. So here they are. So this is joint work with Pedro Martins and Enzo, who's back there. And in case you were not paying attention, so the bottom line from Joanna's presentation, whenever employers have market power, typically they pay lower wages. Okay, that seems to be a fairly well-established fact. And it's certainly one of the reasons why workers' condition has deteriorated over the past few decades, is this increase in monopoly market power. So that's one well-established fact. We're now going to take a next step. What other implications does it have? For example, does it have any implication for firm productivity, for firm performance? That's the question in the table right now. So the starting point, once again, this doesn't seem to be working, because I may need to turn it on, or do I not? Here it is. So the starting point, as I mentioned before, at the general level, this will be one of the themes for the afternoon. Workers' condition is not getting any better. And so the topic here for this presentation, as I mentioned, is what does that mean for firm performance? Now, there's an old theory put forward by Sir John Hicks, was one of the first Nobel laureates in economics, 1970, I believe. But it's an old idea, it's from the 1930s and 1940s. And it's encapsulated in this sentence: the best of all monopoly profits is a quiet life. What does he mean by that? What he meant, what John Hicks meant, was that when a firm has a lot of power, and he was thinking about market power with respect to their consumers, they have a lot of profits, life is easy, and men is just slack. And by quiet life, there's a lot of things that you can mean by quiet life. You get to work at 11 instead of 10, you leave earlier, and play some golf in your office. Maybe you're going to buy a private jet when you really don't need one. I mean, there are a lot of things you can do. Perhaps you could push your workers a little further to be more productive, but who cares? I got so much profit anyway. That's what he meant by the best of monopoly profits is a quiet life. So the tantalizing possibility that we are considering here is, well, could that be true also for labor market power? Could it be that a firm that pays lower wages and therefore earns higher profits, is it possible that the managers of those firms, the owners, will also slack a little more and therefore are less diligent in terms to push for productivity increases? And that's the conceptual framework that we propose, which can be encapsulated and summarized in this chart. So there's the competitive landscape. Labor market concentration in particular is the element of pressure that we're going to be considering on a manager's life, as it were. Then we have the manager's choice itself. How diligent are the managers going to be? How hard are they going to work? It's a trade-off in our model between if you slack, you get a quiet life, that's kind of nice, but there's problem, you might be sacked. Maybe the owners, if you're working for the owners, or maybe your parents, if it's a family company, they will kick you out, say, you're no good, get out of here. So there's a balance, as everything else in life. I want a quiet life. I don't want to be fired from my job as a manager. I'm going to balance that. And the idea, and we showed that formally in the model, is very intuitive, that the less pressure a manager has in this particular case in the labor market, the more they'll slack. And that will show in terms of lower firm productivity. That's the final box in our model. Okay? So this is very simply the conceptual framework that we consider in our paper. And so what we do, in addition to present in a more developed way this framework that I just described to you, what we do is we bring the model to the data and see whether there's any evidence of this relation. So to be clear, what this model predicts is that the greater employment market power there is in a firm, the more the manager will slack and the lower the productivity level will be. So one would expect a negative relation between the degree or some measure of the degree of market power and the level of firm productivity. That's what we're going to test. Now, fortunately, one thing that's great about Portugal is that we actually have fairly decent data for this purpose, microdata. In particular, there's a data set called Quadros do Pessoal, which has been around for quite a while, for decades now, which has the big advantage. So if you are an employer in Portugal and you have even just one employee, you need to file your data with the government, and you're going to be on the database. So, except if you're, I suppose, self-employed, I mean, if you have any employee, you are in this database. We know about you, okay? And so this is a comprehensive data set. It's not just a survey, just to be clear. And we actually have a lot of information. I mean, of course, all the data that we get is anonymized. We don't actually know. When I said I know you, I don't actually. The data is anonymized, but we have a lot of information about the firms, the workers, who they are, age, education, about the firms, how many employees it has, also what type of work you have, what education you have, all sorts of things that you see in here. So that's an important data set. We match that with a second data set, SCIE, and that's a data set that includes additional data at the firm level, in particular financial data that allow us to estimate various performance measures by the firm. So this is an enormous data set, and Enzo will tell you more about that. This can imply many, many hours of strenuous work and waiting for regressions to be run. But that's what we're doing in here. Okay? So the main variables we're interested in trying to test that assumption that market power in labor market is associated with lower firm productivity. So we need a variable for the left-hand side, we need a variable for the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, we're going to have productivity measures. How do you measure firm performance or worker performance? Well, there are a variety of ways you can measure that, and we'll use a variety of measures so as to get better robustness of our results. And in particular, as you can see here, we use revenue per worker. We look at value added per worker, and we also look at total factor productivity. This is a very dear measure for economists, and for non-experts, I suppose a way of explaining that is a firm transforms inputs into outputs. So the idea is that once I control for all the inputs and their quality, if two different firms that have the same inputs, one produces more than the other one, we'll say that the second one has a higher total factor productivity. In other words, it's that change in output level that cannot be explained by the inputs that you have. Very intuitive idea. In a way, it's the part that we cannot measure directly, but we know that it's out there. It has to do with how good the managers are and things like that. On the right-hand side, how do we measure concentration? Well, this is in a way that's become very commonly accepted, and that it was used by Ioana Marinescu and many other authors that she cited in her first presentation. We're going to look at the degree of concentration of employers in a given market and for a given type of job. So to summarize that in some way, this is a measure that varies from 0 to 10,000. So if you have 0, that's a situation when you have many, actually an infinite number of employers, and it would correspond to what economists refer to as perfect competition in the labor market in this case. Whereas if there's only one employer, there's only one person who can hire me in the region where I live and for the job that I'm good at, then that value would be 10,000 or 100 square, to be more precise. That's monopoly or monopsony, as Ioana was mentioning earlier. Of course, in the real world, you don't have either of these extremes, or I mean, rarely. In fact, I'm trying to think about whether in the data there's any extreme of 10,000. I don't think there is one. So most situations in the real world are somewhere between 0 and 10,000. And the higher the value is, the closer you are to monopsony power. The closer to 0 you are, the closer you are to competition. So a higher value of HHI, which is the index that we're using for Herfindahl-Hirschman index. We use HHI because Herfindahl-Hirschman is hard to say and it's very long. So the higher the value of HHI, the higher the degree of monopsony power or employer power. And our theory would predict that that increase or that higher value of H is associated with a lower value of either of the three measures of firm or worker productivity. So here's what the data shows, and let me see if I try to guide you through this table. As I mentioned earlier, we have 3 different measures of productivity that corresponds to 3 different rows, as it were, on this table. And we have 4 different specifications of our model, of our statistical model, that corresponds to 4 columns in this paper. And the difference between the columns is, without getting too technical in here, how many fixed effects we use. It is, in other words, what is it that we're controlling for? And I would say that our preferred regression, our preferred model is the one on the right because it has the most possible controls. The advantage of control is that, there could be many things that are responsible for the variations that we're considering. And we're interested in isolating and focusing, zooming in on the differences that matter, and therefore we're going to control for all of those so-called fixed effects. So if you look at the coefficients on the table in here, I don't know if this is going to work. It does not. Oh, well. What you see is that those coefficients are typically have a negative sign, which is what would be expected from the theoretical framework that I presented to you earlier. And they are estimated with a lot of statistical precision. Part of that is because, we have millions of observations. That helps. And so we are able to estimate with a certain precision that there is indeed a negative relationship between employer market power and firm productivity. Now, if you allow me to comment a little bit on that, the value of that so-called elasticity is very stable across the different specifications, and it is that if you increase the degree of concentration by 1%, firm productivity decreases by 0.888. So that's the value of the elasticity. Okay? Is this relevant? Well, if you were to shift the value of HHI from the 25th percentile to the 75th percentile, you would get an increase in productivity of somewhere between 1.4 and 1.6%. Now, at this stage, there are two schools of thought. One sees the glass half full, the other one half empty. Oh, 1.4, that's nothing. Okay. 1.4, wow, that's a lot. In a way, both are real. I mean, if you think about 1.4%, if you think of an increase in your income by 1.4% forever, permanent increase, that's not too bad. I wouldn't mind getting one, okay? There's another way to think about that, and there's a counterfactual that we run, is imagine a world where employers have no market power. Imagine a world where the value of HHI is equal to 0. So that's an experiment we can do. This is actually not very easy to do because this corresponds to what we refer to as extrapolating out a sample, because we don't see industries with HHI equals 0, so we're actually, shooting our model to a region where that has not been observed. So it's a hard thing to do, but we're trying that with different functional forms, and the result we get is that there is a not huge, but not negligible change as well. Perhaps one way to do that, this is just a funny way, I don't know, what do you think about that? Here's a chart with the productivity levels across Europe, in this particular case, value added per worker, and we have Portugal in red, and then we have a counterfactual of Portugal if there is no market power in green. Now, as you look at the chart, it kind of looks, okay, big deal. We'll skip over Lithuania. Okay, we're not claiming this is the solution to all of Portugal's problems. But we do believe that it is a factor contributing to the relatively low levels of productivity of Portuguese firms. And in fact, coming to a conclusion in here, just to place this result in sort of a broader concept, one of the things that we're doing at the Haddad Productivity Lab, which is one of the labs at the Nova SBE Public Policy Institute, is precisely to study the problem or the issues of productivity in general, but in particular in the case of the Portuguese economy. It's a well-known fact that Portuguese firms, well, I just showed you in the previous chart, are not particularly high by European standards. They're well below European average. They're well below Ireland, for example, which is one of the leading countries in Europe. Why? Here's a list of possible culprits. Oh, Portuguese firms are very small. Oh, workers lacking human capital. Oh, it's management quality. Managers in Portugal are not well trained. Oh, maybe perhaps is they lack ambition. I hear that a lot. And in fact, Nova's former dean has a book precisely about that. Or maybe it's because they're family firms and family firms tend not to be as productive. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe because they have a lot of product market power. I'm not so sure about that. What we're adding to this list is, well, maybe they have a lot of employer power with respect to their workers. And by the way, one other important point that I also include in this list, I mean, a lot of workers in Portugal work for public administration. So let's not forget about that. So there's also issues of productivity in public administration. So there's a long list in here, and think of this paper as a contribution to this important study by examining one of the items on the list. And with that, I'll stop here, and I look forward to discussion of this paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luís. I will now give the floor to Roberto Rocha for his discussion. Thank you, Roberto.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for the invite, Pedro, Luis. It was a pleasure reading the paper, and it's a pleasure to be part of the discussion today. Yeah, okay. So I'm Roberto Rocha. I'm a new faculty here, and it was a nice reading this paper by the three of you. So I think this paper asks like a super important research question, which is, how does employer market concentration affect firm productivity? This is important for two main reasons, right? First is this trend on labor market concentration being increasing around the world, but also the fact that productivity is stagnant, or productivity growth is stagnant, especially in modern economies and in European economies. I think the paper tries to motivate it and tries to like push this kind of quiet life narrative, which is super interesting, but it's even more interesting if you think about this question as a two-sided question, because you can have this negative effect story, but one... The microphone? Yeah, sorry. Of course, but also, like, I think my prior before reading the paper was that you would actually have like positive effects of labor market concentration of productivity, because I think that would be like the prediction of a simple monopsonist model. So this makes the results even more interesting, that it kind of like suggests a new potential avenue and another side of this two-sided questions to the correlation or the results of labor market concentration on firm productivity. So just a quick recap of what the paper does. They use data from Portugal from the last 20 years, merging quadrante pessoal and the SCIE, defining labor markets as an occupation municipality pair, and run regressions of the HHI on differential measures of productivity. They find this negative and robust effects of labor market concentration on firm productivity. And as I tried to put it in words, but Luis did the same in the last slides, a 1% increase in the firm's average local labor market concentration would be associated with this 0.008% decrease in firm's productivity. And my reaction was the same, like kind of at the first glance it might seem small, but they do a very nice job in the paper of showing that actually by moving from this 25th percentile to the 75th percentile, the predicted decrease in firms' productivity would be of between 1.4 and 1.6, which for me is actually quite substantial. I was in the glass half full part of the people that would see the presentation. Okay, I had some kind of ideas or suggestions on like how to think through the paper as actually kind of like potential further results that you could show. As my way of reading the theoretical reasoning follows the three steps that kind of were shown in the presentation. So a firm facing higher labor market concentration, they will have to pay lower wages. By then, it will open room for the manager to exert less effort, so to slack or to have this quiet life, and thus having these negative effects on productivity. So my take is that it kind of like would be nice to fill this narrative also with empirical results in the middle parts of it, because we kind of have the results of the first bullet point relative to the third bullet point. So if we had like an idea of what was the magnitude of this labor market concentration effects on wages, we could have even like this kind of this middle point elasticity between wages and productivity and what's going on there. And I also was thinking, like, if there is any way in the data, I think this is very hard, but to quantify this manager's effort, if there's any kind of like hours workers that the top paid employee is having, or bonuses, but I believe this is harder usually in admin data to have. But overall, just to conclude, I think I have like a kind of like a double takeaway viewing this paper as well. So I think a first reaction is a kind of more pessimistic one in my mind. So there are these large trends of labor market concentration increasing over time. And you can think that, okay, this is a problem because this is affecting wages, and now this paper shows that it's even a bigger problem because this could potentially affect productivity as well. And productivity is one of the like, it could even exacerbate like Europe's ongoing productivity stagnation. But you could, I think, like especially in like a more policy perspective, you can also have an optimistic interpretation of this. If you have like some kind of problem that is affecting both wages and productivity, targeted policies towards this problem can have like a pretty good win-win outcome, where you can even have like situations where you reduce labor market concentration, you increase wages and productivity. And this is kind of rare if you think about like public policies which are often faced in this kind of equity efficiency trade-off. You either increase wages or you increase productivity. So what this paper suggests is that this is actually a problem where you can have like this policies that tackle this problem can have like this win-win component. And one key takeaway, and probably like a takeaway further of this workshop, that labor market concentration should be kind of central when thinking about these labor policies and competition and industrial ones. I'm happy to have other comments that I wrote down in the slides, or more technical ones, but that's all I had for the discussion today, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We are running a little late, but I think there may be time for maybe one additional question from the audience, and then maybe Luis, you'd like to respond also to Roberto's questions? Or maybe not, there is no question from the audience, and then, oh, there are two, okay. Please, if you could be short.
This one is for Luis, yes. I was just wondering if the negative relationship between firm productivity and employer market power applies to basically all industries, or if there are some industries that actually benefit from employer market power.
So that is an interesting question. We did not look specifically at industry-specific patterns. We do include fixed effects, so we take into account that different industries and different firms may be exposed to different relationships or effects of employer market concentration. But I don't recall here and now that we did any specific analysis of whether there were industry patterns that affected that. Perhaps that's something we should be looking at in the future.
Thank you. One final question, and then maybe Luis can also respond to
So going back to the quiet life part, have you also considered the monopoly power, how it interacts also with monopsony? So maybe higher monopsony firms have also higher monopoly, and then you go back to your initial quote.
That is a very interesting question, but that is a very difficult and challenging data question. So we have fairly good data about the worker's job, what kind of job description they have. We have many different categories, and we have a fairly precise categorization of the labor market. It's very difficult to do that for the product market, among other things, because firms typically are present in multiple markets. So I wish I could give you a better answer. I can tell that, I mean, as I look at the case of Portugal, and this may be a little bit of a generalization, but I would say that the vast majority of firms in our sample do not have a lot of market power. In fact, Portuguese firms, by European standards, are relatively small in size and have relatively little product market power. This is one of the reasons why I believe that in Portugal, employer market power is an important question, because there's not a lot of product market power. But beyond that, I don't have an answer for you on that, even though I do agree that it's an important question. And finally, because we're running out of time in here, in the interest of staying on schedule, just a few comments. Thank you for the discussion, Roberto. I think you made a lot of interesting points. The technical ones, we should probably talk about that later. Let me just say one thing that he brought up that I think is very important. Our paper currently is looking at the top box and the bottom box of our model. It's black boxing the middle. And that is something that we can, and we're working on and to explore for several reasons. First, because it turns out this is not the only theory about how firms work. And so in the paper, if you read it carefully, in the current version, and especially in future versions, we'll be contemplating alternative stories about it. But what Robert says, I think, makes a ton of sense. We could and we should look at the intermediate step, the effect on wages, which, by the way, Pedro and others have done before, and so we can certainly incorporate that in our paper. And so if you're interested, stay tuned for a future version of the paper. We'll be talking about that. And with that, and in interest of staying on time, which we're more or less doing just with a few minutes of delay, I would like now to introduce our next speaker, and that will be Pedro himself, and he'll be talking about another project that we're working on in the context of NPPI. Pedro?
Thank you.
There you go.
Okay. So again, thank you very much for attending and participating in this event. So this second paper follows very closely from the first one in terms of many aspects of its methodology, its motivation. However, it looks at a radically different outcome variable. So we move away from the more, if you wish, core domains of economics and venture into the new field that is much closer to demography, and this is, as the title indicates, the issue of fertility, and more specifically, the issue of employee childbearing. Okay, so we move away from wages, from job amenities, we move away from promotions, dismissals, all that will, of course, still stay in the background to some extent. However, our key outcome of interest is now about whether employees have children or not, and the relationship between that outcome and the conditions that these individuals face in terms of their labor market. Okay, so we are venturing into this new area because we believe it's quite important. And indeed, as you all know, we have been witnessing important changes in terms of the fertility levels in many countries, in particular in the developed world. So these statistics that, again, are fairly familiar indicate that fertility levels in Portugal, for instance, is clearly below the replacement level. So this number that is frequently mentioned of 2.1 children per woman, this is a figure that is clearly not met in the context of Portugal, which has a value currently of about 1.4. Okay, so there are some other extreme cases, such as that of Italy, and there are some Italian students in the group, so they are also very familiar with this, which are even lower at around 1.2 or 1.3 children per woman. Okay, so we would like to ask in this paper to what extent may. Okay, so yes, I forgot. I gave this reference to Roberto, and I forgot it to apply it to myself, but let's try to do a little better. So we want to see if indeed part of the explanation for this potentially worrying development may be the circumstances that workers, and perhaps particularly women workers, face in their labor markets. So, of course, this is something that is very much on the news. There are also many policy initiatives around potential measures that may revert this trend towards lowering and declining fertility levels. So just a couple of weeks ago, so some reference to the cost that employment may have had in terms of maternity. So those of you that read Portuguese will see that. We'll have a little translation there. So this is something that people definitely care a lot about, not only within the domains of economics, but very much across society. So this article hints at a causal relationship. So you'll see the usage of the word custo, so sort of a payment as a consequence of maternity. So, of course, this is also something that is very dear to our efforts. We want to establish causal links. We want to move beyond mere correlations, even if they may also be quite important, of course. We want to establish causal links because we believe these are really of paramount importance in terms of establishing evidence that may be of policy relevance. So we ask this question. So does employer power, which we proxy through the lenses of market concentration, does it affect and in particular reduce fertility? That's our question, to pose it as clearly as possible. So we have a fairly sophisticated model. Perhaps Luis will disagree with this because he's very proficient in developing models and many other things, of course. But our thinking of these relationships essentially have to do with the idea that if there are fewer employers out there, of course, this will induce an increase in terms of employer power. Employers will have a greater scope to disfavor workers that request parental leave, in the sense that there is a need for a replacement, recruitment will have to be conducted, you'll have to train this new worker, you'll have to sort of try to improve the quality of the match between the new worker that is replacing the worker on leave. So there is a lot of effort that must go into the job of an employer when a worker goes into parental leave. Okay? So this is just the basics economics. We can, of course, have moral issues about this, but from a standard, very straightforward, practical perspective, this is something that I believe one should acknowledge. Of course, there are social benefits to maternity, to paternity, but of course, from the perspective of the employer, one may think that indeed, to the extent that employees anticipate the potential negative consequences that may follow from paternity or maternity, if there are fewer alternatives in the labor market, their engagement, their eagerness to be a father or a mother may diminish. So this is our thinking, this is our motivation. Perhaps you'd find it straightforward, but in any case, I believe it provides good context to our empirical analysis. Okay, so Luis did most of the work on this part. So we are using the same data set with, of course, the major difference that now we are using the individual level version of the data set. Okay, so previously we were looking at a firm level variable, which is the productivity of the firm. In this case, we are looking at an individual level variable. That is, whether an individual in a particular year becomes a mother or a father. Okay, so this is possible because very recently a new set of variables was added to this very interesting data set, quadros de pessoal, personnel records. So only a few months ago was this variable introduced. It is now available for the period starting from 2010, and it indicates if workers were on leave, and moreover, what was the reason behind this particular leave. And one of such reasons is specifically the absence for parental leave. Okay? So this is what we exploit from this perspective of trying to understand if indeed employer concentration may have had an impact in terms of parental leave, which is, of course, for reasons that we can also go into more detail, is a good proxy for an actual situation of giving birth to a child or being a new parent to a child. Okay, so we are now working at the local labor market level. So this is following from the intersection between a large set of occupations measured at the 4-digit level, so fairly detailed understanding of different occupations. And on top of that, we also consider the regional dimension, which is a proxy for the commuting zones of different individuals, so that we can understand what are their potential alternatives in terms of recruitment. Okay. So this is our setup. Okay, so we are making use of this new variable. It's really a very interesting variable. There's also nice information about strikes, about absences for sickness. Okay, a number of reasons that can also be explored for, I'm sure, multiple projects in the future. Okay, so we can go into the details, as I mentioned, but we believe that our information is a good proxy for birth, okay, particularly for women. So it is a little less so for men, given that the period, the duration of leaves in the case of men tends to be much shorter. Okay, so there are some limitations there, but particularly in the case of women, we believe that we can pick up these cases. So we can start our analysis from a very simplistic perspective, just plotting the data and looking at potential relationships between different concentration levels and different rates of leaves for childbearing reasons. And if we do this very simple exercise, we have some promising, encouraging results suggesting that there is a negative relationship. So, but we just put it out there just to motivate what we do in a more, I believe, sophisticated and accurate way from the perspective of getting into causal effects. Okay, and so what is our approach? So we have a simple equation where we have, as I indicated before, where we have as the dependent variable a dummy variable, a dichotomous variable that takes value 1 if in that particular year, which is measured from the perspective of a particular month, the month of October, the individual had childbearing related leave. Okay, so we are picking up these instances. Okay, so in most cases, we are covering the entire population of the country from the perspective of employment relationships. In most cases, these will be zeros, so workers will not be absent for reasons of childbearing domain. So in those cases, those will be zeros, but occasionally we do see a few ones indicating that the worker was away for the full month or a large part of the month for reasons that have to do with childbearing. Okay. So what is it that we consider on the right-hand side? Following on the discussion before from Luis, we use different measures of labor market concentration. Okay. So we also play with different transformations of the variable. Essentially, we are comparing situations where there is more and less concentration at the time when the leave event was or was not observed. So on top of that, we have a large set of control variables, the so-called fixed effects that will soak up all potential sources, a large range of potential sources of variation in terms of the childbearing outcome. Okay? So one particular variable is controlling for the firm in which the worker is located. Okay? So that means that we are comparing colleagues in the same firm that happen to be facing local labor markets of different concentration levels. Okay, so and why is that? Because different workers will be conducting different jobs, they will be registered with different occupations, and despite the fact that they may be placed in the same geographical location, their circumstances in terms of the actual level of concentration of the labor market may be very different. Okay, so we are exploiting this fairly restrictive, demanding range of variation. On top of that, we are also using a fairly standard methodology in the literature in terms of using variation in terms of this level of concentration that is potentially driven by exogenous factors, namely regarding the level of concentration in other districts. Okay? So we don't have time to go into that, but I would argue this is a fairly standard approach in the specific literature of, say, wage effects of local labor market concentration. So I'm probably running out of time. What is it that we are finding in the study? So we present the results for different groups of workers. Okay, so we use these bars to indicate at the very top what is the average level for those in which there is no say, a benchmark level of childbearing rates, okay, that corresponds to a low level of concentration. Okay? And then we see by how much the childbearing rate declines, because it is indeed negative coefficients that we find in our results. We see by how much this childbearing rate declines when the worker potentially moves from the 25th percentile of the Erfindal distribution to the 75th percentile of the same distribution. Okay, so we have the magnitude of these bars indicating the variation with respect to a reference value. Okay, so the reference values are fairly low, as we already discussed. So the levels of childbearing are fairly small across the board, in line with the general results for Portugal and other countries. But the critical point is that we find this massive declines in the childbearing rate, which, if we put that in proportion with respect to the original value, leads to declines of around 90%, typically higher for women than for men. Okay, so that's our main result. Admittedly, the reference point is fairly low because these events are fairly rare, but still from this relative perspective, our findings indicate that working in local labor markets of different concentration levels can potentially have a very significant impact in terms of declining levels of fertility. So of course we can also compare across different groups. So for instance, we find that this is an effect that comes mostly for younger individuals, which are defined here as those that are younger than 40, and are stronger for women than for men. Okay? So when it comes to older women and older men, the effects are not statistically significant. So this is the gist of the presentation, and I guess I need to conclude. So we conduct a lot of additional robustness checks. So different ways of thinking about parental leave, different control variables, different specifications, also an analysis of other types of leave. So I mentioned a few: sickness, strike, and so on. We don't find those effects. We don't find any significant effects in those cases. So finally, we try to go a little beyond this core analysis by considering some additional margins. So in particular, not only whether there is a leave situation or not, but also the duration of the leave. Okay? So we can also estimate this duration from the difference between the normal working hours and the actual working hours. So we can see if the person was on leave for a longer period or a shorter period, and we also find effects on that intensive dimension. Perhaps the very last point concerns this big literature on the child penalty. Okay, so there are a number of interesting studies that show that following childbirth, women in particular tend to have systematically lower levels of wages and of employment. Okay? So very interesting studies, a recent review of economic studies on this matter. So this is a fairly stylized fact for a large number of countries. So there is a child penalty coming with childbirth, particularly for women. So what we do is to replicate those results using our data set, but then we add a twist, which is we also consider the potential effect of the level of local labor market concentration that the individuals experience at the time of childbirth. Okay, so we are asking, is it that the magnitude of the child penalty can vary depending on the concentration that these individuals were exposed to at the time that they had their children? And we find that indeed, in line with the previous results, if this individual was facing a more concentrated market at the time of childbirth, the reductions in terms of subsequent wages and in terms of the subsequent probability of employment will be even higher. Okay, so this is something that perhaps can also be seen in line with the theoretical model. So let's conclude. So I think we delivered interesting new evidence of a very different channel of potential effects of labor market concentration, namely the fertility dimension. Of course, this will make us think about potential policy avenues. I think this will strengthen the importance of promoting competition in labor markets, for instance, through entrepreneurship. If there are more businesses out there, then employers will have more employees will have more alternatives, so the level of concentration will drop. Okay, so this was already something that was established as being important. I think following these results, this may be regarded to be even more important. Of course, issues regarding the enforcement of parental rights. This is also something that follows from our results. So this supports the idea that workers, they perhaps are a little unsure about to what extent they will have good parental rights following their childbirth. So this is something that they may consider and may dissuade them in some cases from having children. And finally, perhaps to look at things from a more positive perspective, maybe one should think more about how to incentivize family-friendly policies with firms. Okay, so we should promote this alignment between the goals of society and their individuals, many of whom want to have perhaps more children, and the goals of firms that want to be profitable. So one idea that we have been discussing about this is the introduction of experience rating in social security contributions, taking into account parental leave metrics. So what's the idea there? If you happen to be the owner of a firm whose employees tend to have higher levels of childbearing, perhaps you should be compensated for that. Perhaps you should really have a better alignment between what is good for the firm and what is good for society. So this may be a little bit of a missing link in terms of promotion of this alignment between businesses and society. And I'll stop here, so hopefully on time, and I would give the floor to Leonor Rossi, who has very kindly accepted to be the discussant for this presentation. Thank you so much, Leonor.
So first, I'm not an economist. Those of you who know me know that. And thank you, Pedro, and the other authors of the paper. When I was reading the paper, I was thinking, oh my God, they think so differently from us. This is absolutely marvelous. So one of my first comments is, given that you're writing about Portugal, for me it's rather bizarre to observe some of the findings, because let me just say that in the performance of firms, something that I don't see in the paper, maybe I haven't read it properly in the sense of the econometrics, I think tax plays a massive role. Because when you say that a company underperforms, sometimes what companies do is that you don't declare your output because otherwise it's going to be taxed. So you load up all these expenses and that you can, and you actually have money, but it means that the system is also not good at letting you save money. Because if you try to save money, you're going to be taxed, or distributed, you're going to be taxed so high that you're not going to do it. So there could be, when we say Portuguese firms are not very productive, I'm not sure that's the whole story. And so I think it's important. Then I was wondering if also in wages, because of tax, again, there are a lot of hidden components in wages that don't come out as a salary, so the wages look very low, but there are perks and other things that are used sort of to give people higher salaries. And so also in Portugal, from my experience, I'm a litigation lawyer, I'm not a labor lawyer, but I'm a litigation lawyer. The labor law on parental rights is absolutely clear to everyone, in the public sector, in the private sector, and to the firms, because the penalties are so high if you break them, even not just legal penalties but reputational penalties, that this would cause some harm. to the firm. And I don't think firms, I think they might try to work their way around other barriers, but not parental leave. Then looking at, I was thinking, you know, I have 3 children, right? And when I was reading your paper, it was late, and one of my children walks in and says, "Would you listen to one of my presentations?" And I thought, this is a child penalty, I'm still paying. And you know, he's 23. And I said, yes, of course. And just to think, I hope none of the other 2 have a presentation they want me to listen to. But also, I was also thinking that you spoke about young women. In their paper, they say young women are from until 40. And I was thinking, I had my kids until I was 40, before I was 40. So I was considered young at the time. But it could also be about perfecting skills. You know, because you start working, and then you can't just step into a job and step out of a job and then step back. So maybe you're holding out because you want to get better at it, because there are thresholds in your job that you want to meet. Imagine being a lawyer, you want to pass the bar exam, and then you want to pass another. I don't know, putting off the birth is not necessarily, in my view, look at that. Then for me, I find your findings bizarre, because I suppose, I'm not an economist, so maybe I'm saying things very silly, that a higher concentration means that the firms are slightly bigger, at least. And in a slightly bigger firm, you have a wider space for your career. And you have higher positions, you know, there must be a higher scale of positions. So, and also in concentrated markets, so I'm saying again, larger firms that don't have so many competitors, that's where teams exist. You're much more likely to have a team of people in a larger firm than in a smaller firm. So if I leave, if I'm in a bigger firm, I can have one of my team sort of, you know, it's not necessarily a replacement, but it can be re-shared. If it's a small firm, I'm the only one there in that job. And then, of course, they have to replace me, because just being absent is an absolute disaster for the firm, because I was the only one doing the job. You understand what I'm saying? So I would say that bigger firms would actually be much more cool about giving you child leave and parental leave, because they would be supposedly more able to replace me without a necessity to permanently dismiss me. Then I'm also surprised about the article that say that a lot of pregnant women or child people entitled to parental leave or after parental leave were dismissed, because once again, the law would really punish them unless there's some sort of like collective dismissal involved, that you could have been looking at firms that are, maybe firms are collectively dismissing more, and that means that you're including into this cake people who would have leave and not. But it would be difficult to say in Portugal, given our law, to be fired immediately after you come back from your child leave, and then maybe that you wouldn't litigate, because the probability of getting something back would be high. So I'm happy that we have this divergence of view. It probably means you're right and I'm wrong, but it's the labor law in Portugal, and you know, is very, very, because you say like leaves tend to be shorter. That's almost impossible. They'd go after your employer saying, you didn't give them 6 months. How did this worker? That's why I'm surprised. We have a very, very, but we can talk. I hope this makes sense. And thank you. Thank you for inviting me, because it was very, very interesting to see this from a different perspective.
Thank you, Lena.
I'm not sure how we are doing with time. We are right on time. The keynote
Is there, yeah.
Maybe we should...
You want to have a very quick answer, or should we move on?
Yeah, maybe just to say, I think
You can discuss during the break too.
Yes. But I think the point about bigger firms and smaller firms, perhaps I would just emphasize that one. So it's a nice robustness check that we can do. I understand where you're coming from. So bigger firms can have potentially the conditions to better accommodate this. But we will be comparing bigger firms that are operating in markets with different levels of concentration. So from that perspective, it seems to be making a difference. But great points. Thank you so much, Leonor. So perhaps we
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Leonor. And in the interest of staying on schedule, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Professor Eric Posner. So Eric Posner is the Kirkland and Ellis Distinguished Service Professor of Law at the University of Chicago Law School. Over the past several years, Professor Posner has become a leading scholar examining how labor market concentration and employer market power have contributed to wage suppression and inequality in America. In his 2021 book, How Antitrust Failed Workers, Professor Posner documents how antitrust law has historically failed to address anti-competitive practices by employers. His influential work with co-authors Suresh Naidu and Glenn Weil on antitrust remedies for labor market power won the Jeremy S. Cohen Award for Antitrust Scholarship in 2019 and proposed new methods for evaluating how mergers and other practices affect labor markets. Through his scholarship and policy advocacy, Posner has helped catalyze a movement to use antitrust law to protect workers from employer monopsony power. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of the American Law Institute. So I hope that the technology is ready to bring Eric Posner online, and please join me in welcoming Professor Eric Posner.
Thanks very much. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you. And could you just verify you can hear me? Yes. Yeah, great. Okay, I'm going to share some slides. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, and you can see the slides, right? Yeah, okay. I'm going to assume you can see the slides. So I'm very pleased to talk to you. I really wish I were there in Lisbon. It's one of my favorite cities. I've been there many times and look forward to coming back sometime, and then I'll be able to meet you in person. I did want to say that I'm not sure there's time for questions or answers. If not, feel free to email me. You can find my email address on the web very easily. Final introductory point. I'm going to show you a bunch of slides. Some of this will look a little bit redundant. I understand Ioana Marinescu already spoke to you about the economics. I'd want to nonetheless go over a little bit of the economics, especially the empirical literature, but I will do that quickly. And then the focus of my talk will be American competition law or American antitrust law, which is what I know best. Okay, I want to start with a kind of famous scandal in the United States. It's actually all but forgotten now, but back in 2010, the Justice Department sued a number of the most famous and admired companies in the United States, including Apple, Google, Pixar, and many others. And they sued these companies for engaging in what's called a no-poach conspiracy, which is basically like a market division agreement. The companies had agreed not to recruit from each other's workforces. And I'm showing here an email, which is an exhibit that the government put together for the trial. There was no trial, it was a settlement instead, but this is an exhibit from the government. And if you look at the bottom, there's an email from the famous Steve Jobs to the somewhat less famous Eric Schmidt, the head of Google. And it says, Eric, I am told that Google's new cell phone software group is relentlessly recruiting in our iPod group. if this is in Pixar and Disney, but then and Jobs was at Pixar at the time, and then he would later go to Apple, and apparently he brought this idea of no poach agreements to the other companies that he was involved in, including, of course, Apple. At its height, this conspiracy involved more than 40 employers, and you probably can't read the slide very well, but these employers include not only Google and Apple, but IBM, eBay, Sun Microsystem, Oracle, Dell, Best Buy, which is a big retail store in the United States, Disney, DreamWorks, Lucasfilm, and even retail stores like J.Crew. About 60,000 employees were involved, and according to a recent estimate by an economist, Matthew Gibson, there was a total of $3.1 billion in lost wages. These wages were lost because these firms were not competing over these employees who are mostly software engineers. So as I mentioned, the government sued several of these companies. They settled, and then subsequently there was private litigation, which resulted in another settlement of several $100 million. And then everybody forgot about this case, except for the government, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, Ioana Marinescu might have shown you this map, and I just want to tell you a little bit about the empirical research. I'm going to go through it very quickly. But a key thing to understand here is that this no-poach case involving the Silicon Valley firms took place in 2010. And then, I think rather coincidentally, over the next 5 to 10 years, a number of economists got interested in labor market concentration. And so this early paper by Azar, Marinescu, Steinbaum, and Tosca documents the high level of labor market concentration in the United States. And so millions and millions and millions of workers in the United States basically have very little choice among employers who would pay for their skills, maybe 2 or 3 or 4. Of course, this tends to be more true in rural areas, small towns, and suburbs. In the big cities, there is significantly more labor market competition. So, but the red and the yellow colors and the orange colors show where in the United States there's a very high level of concentration. Okay, this is of course important for competition law because we tend to use a high level of concentration as a proxy for market power. This is true for labor market power as well as product market power. And so this is at least a concern because where firms don't face much competition, they can engage in various types of exploitative behavior. There's another group of empirical research involving mergers and acquisitions. And just to summarize this very quickly, there is substantial evidence that when firms merge, and those firms compete for the same labor force, and those firms are in a concentrated market, the merger will result in lower wages. Okay, so a simple example taken from the Prager and Schmidt paper, imagine a small town with 3 hospitals. The hospitals employ a variety of workers with health skill specialties, doctors, nurses, pharmacists. Before the merger, 3 hospitals are competing for these people. After the merger, 2 hospitals are competing for these people. According to Prager and Schmidt, the data suggests that the merger will result in lower wage growth for the people whose skills are tied to hospital work. Okay, another group of empirical research looks at collusion and coordination. The most important type of collusion in the United States, and I suspect in other countries as well, is the overuse of covenants not to compete. Covenants not to compete are agreements between employers and workers, according to which after the worker leaves employment, the worker is not permitted to be employed by a competing employer for a certain number of years, a couple years, for example, 2 years maybe, 1 year, and within a defined geographic area, which might be a city or a town, or sometimes the whole country or even the whole world. In the United States, like other countries, non-compete clauses have historically been regulated. In the United States, they've been regulated under state common law and statutory law, but this type of regulation is quite limited. And non-competes can also be thought of as just a kind of vertical restraint that, if used with a large number of employees, can cause anti-competitive outcomes. And I'll give you an example in a few minutes. There's been a lot of research on non-competes. The research suggests that as many as 20% of Americans, or more even, are subject to non-competes. A very large number of very low-income workers are subject to non-competes. And there's an increasing amount of evidence that suggests that people who are bound by non-competes are paid less than people who are not bound by non-competes. And that's simply because the result of the non-compete is to reduce competition. If you're an employee and you don't like your job, you might be tempted to look for a job with someone else. But if you're subject to a non-compete clause, that firm wouldn't be able to hire you, and you wouldn't be able to leave without breaching the contract. Another type of collusion that has gotten a lot of attention in the United States are no-poach agreements that are used by franchises. And so a famous article by Kruger and Ashenfelter showed that over 50% of major franchisors in the United States impose no-poach agreements on their franchisees. So we're talking about very well-known companies like McDonald's and Burger King. These companies work through franchise arrangements. They have franchise contracts with independent companies. And those franchise arrangements typically have non-competes, or used to, which would prevent one franchisee from hiring workers from another franchisee. And finally, there's a small amount of interesting research on parallel or possibly collusive wage setting, especially in the professions. So in the United States, economists have discovered that lawyers, doctors, engineers, psychologists, they're often paid a very similar amount of money, controlling for seniority. And that amount of money tends to be not connected to their actual marginal revenue product or skill level. And this is suggestive evidence that companies either engage in follow the leader style wage setting or actually collude. And then finally, there's been a lot of empirical research in foreign countries as well, including Portugal, of course, but many other countries in Europe and Latin America. And this research has come to similar results. Labor concentration is quite high in foreign markets. And to a surprising extent, non-competes are very common in countries across the world. This is a table taken from Iraqi and his co-authors, or I'm sorry, maybe her co-authors. This shows the percentage of labor markets in various countries: Belgium, Great Britain, USA, Australia, and so forth. And as you can see, in many of these countries, as many as 5 to 10%, up to 15% of their labor markets are highly concentrated. And then even more, then there are even an additional percentage of labor markets are moderately concentrated. So these are markets where employees might realistically have a choice between 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 employers. So that's the evidence. And then a little bit of economics. I assume most of you or all of you know this, but I just wanted to put it on a slide so that we're all thinking about the same thing, right? So traditionally in American antitrust law and in European competition law, regulators and courts have been concerned with monopoly or collusion in product markets. So you think of this as the supply chain. You have a firm, call it firm one. Maybe it has a monopoly. Maybe it has a monopoly because it's managed to exclude rivals like firm two. As a result of that, it can charge customers higher prices. That hurts customers and causes deadweight loss as well, because some people can't afford those high prices. Now, as economists have known for quite a long time, even going back to Adam Smith, this type of firm can engage in the same type of behavior upstream. So think of firm one also excluding firm two from the upstream market. Now, the upstream market could be other firms supplying goods and services, but a labor market is also an upstream market. So firm one is able to exclude other employers like firm two from competition for workers. That enables firm one to push down wages. If wages are pushed down, then there will be fewer workers who are willing to work, and they may be driven out of the labor market. Firm one, in both cases, obtains monopoly profits or rents at the expense of their counterparty, whether it's consumers or workers. Now, some people, I don't know about, the level, how people think about a labor market in Portugal and Europe. But in the United States, I've presented this literature to a lot of people. And people, especially people with no economic training, often react by saying, what's so bad about monopsony? And so the intuition here is that I think a lot of people have, is that it's actually good if firms have monopsony power, because if that means that they can lower wages, which of course just means lowering their labor costs, that's going to benefit the consumers, because some of that will be passed on to consumers as lower prices. Okay, now that is theoretically possible in certain narrow circumstances, but it is not actually what the economic theory says. So if you look at the right figure, which shows monopsony as opposed to monopoly, you'll see that when wages go down, that results in fewer people working. If fewer people are working, then firms are employing fewer people, and that means that firms are producing less. So if they're producing less, that's deadweight loss, and it usually will mean higher prices as well. And the bottom line here is, from the standpoint of the people who are hurt, there's a sense in which it doesn't really matter whether a firm engages in monopoly or monopsony. They're equally bad. Monopoly results in higher prices, which reduces demand for products, with the result that employers will fire workers and lower wages. Monopsony results in lower wages, which means that fewer people will work, which means that employers will produce less, which will result in higher prices for consumers. In other words, monopsony and monopoly are just forms of market failure, which generally will cause harm to anybody who's involved in those markets, except for the monopolist or the monopsonist who obtains rents as a result of this activity. Okay, in the interest of time, let me push ahead to the different types of anti-competitive behavior in labor markets and how American law treats this behavior. So basically, American law divides, and I think European law does this too in a similar way. It divides the world of anti-competitive behavior into three categories. One category is illegally obtaining or maintaining a monopoly or monopsony. Okay, monopolies, if they're obtained through anti-competitive behavior, are bad for people because they charge higher prices and reduce output. So that's covered by there's section 2 of the Sherman Act. Second, we have traditional cartels. So if two firms get together to fix prices, that's a violation of section 1. If they get together to fix wages, that's also a violation of section 1. And if firms get together to divide markets, for example, to agree not to compete for each other's customers or for each other's workers, that's also a market division agreement in violation of section 1. And then finally, we have mergers and acquisitions, which are regulated under Section 7 of the Clayton Act. And just as people should worry that mergers might result in monopoly power and higher prices, mergers can also result in monopsony power and lower wages. So a striking fact is that while economic theory treats monopoly and monopsony as symmetrical evils, in the area of regulation, there's far more litigation involving monopolies or product side, output side, anti-competitive behavior than labor side anti-competitive behavior. So this graph, which is a little bit dated, is just to give you a rough idea of what litigation looks like in the United States. The blue bar shows the number of antitrust cases that were litigated over the last number of years, 3 years, that involved traditional kind of product market claims. A monopoly charging excessive prices, a cartel raising prices or fixing prices. And then the reddish orange bar shows the number of cases that involve labor markets. And as you can see, there are vastly more product market cases than labor market cases, which is not to say that there are none, especially in recent years, there's been an increasing number of labor market cases. And I'll talk about a few of them shortly. But we have seen more of these no-poach and wage-fixing cases. So no-poach cases similar to the Silicon Valley case, but involving different firms, including, meat processing companies and dialysis supply companies and all kinds of companies. There have been a number of Section 2 monopsony cases, often involving sports leagues. And then finally, there have been some recent merger challenges that have focused on the labor market impacts of mergers rather than the product market impacts. Now, before I talk about some of these cases, I want to tell you a little bit about why there might be this litigation gap, why there might be the difference in the number of cases involving labor markets and product markets. So one very simple explanation is that for a very long time, economists tend to assume that labor markets are competitive. And economists in the United States have a lot of influence on antitrust law. So the antitrust regulators probably assumed, along with the economists, that labor markets are competitive, which means that there aren't any antitrust concerns. The significance of the empirical literature that I showed you at the beginning of my remarks is that it has completely overturned that assumption. And now it's much more common for regulators in the United States and courts to consider the possibility that there's anti-competitive behavior in labor markets. Another assumption was that antitrust law was only concerned about consumers and not about workers. That is not actually true and never has been true about the law, and it certainly doesn't make any sense. And then there's some other reasons as well, having to do with just the tradition in American history. For a long time, people assumed that to the extent workers were in vulnerable positions, they would be protected by unions or by other areas of the law. Whether that was true in the past, it's no longer true today. Fortunately, regulators have become aware of this empirical work, and they're now much more seriously challenging employers than they have in the past. And this is even true of the Trump administration, despite its deregulatory instincts. Both the FTC and the DOJ have confirmed that they will continue to bring antitrust cases addressing labor market monopsony or cartels. And so, as I mentioned before, there have been quite a few recent cases, a number of merger challenges, a number of cases involving no-poach agreements, and a couple cases involving, monopsonies. In addition, the merger guidelines were updated. But what I really want to do is to show you a few of these cases to give you a sense of how this litigation is taking place, what it looks like. So I'm gonna give you two quick case studies. The first is the Penguin Random House merger challenge. So Penguin Random House is a huge commercial publisher, and Simon & Schuster is another huge commercial publisher. And a number of years ago, they announced that they plan to merge. As you can see, they both own pretty large, they both enjoy pretty large shares of the market. These is the market for commercial books that they sell, nonfiction, fiction, the sort of regular books that people buy. Now, traditionally, if the regulators challenge this merger, they would challenge it based on its product market effects. They might say, for example, if this merger is allowed to go through, the merged firm, Penguin Random House, Simon & Schuster, would raise prices for readers. But instead, the Department of Justice challenged the merger based on its impact of workers, meaning in this case, authors, people who sell their manuscripts to publishers and then earn royalties and advances. So this is the case that the Department of Justice brought. They start by pointing out that if you do the standard HHI analysis, the labor market concentration, so this is the concentration of authors who are scattered all over the United States and even the world, but these firms have such big shares that the HHI would increase significantly. And then the Department of Justice retained economists to provide a more fine-grained analysis of the potential impact of the merger. So this is a very interesting slide that the Justice Department's expert showed. And it just shows how it works when somebody, a famous author like Stephen King, submits a manuscript to these publishers. Namely, they hold an auction. And so in this particular case, what the expert pointed out is that often there were only 6 publishers at the time. Many of the publishers would drop out, leaving only Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster left, and those two companies would continue to bid with each other. And so in this particular example, for someone's memoir, the author wasn't identified, the resulting advance was $825,000. That was the result of competition between Penguin Random House and Simon & Schuster. If they had been one firm, then the bidding would have ended at $650,000 when all of the other publishers had dropped out, right? So this is a very clear way of thinking about how a merger would affect labor market compensation. The expert also used data from Simon & Schuster and Penguin Random House to show that when somebody is considering Simon & Schuster as their publisher, they will typically go to Random House if they're unsatisfied with Simon & Schuster's offer. So this is what's called head-to-head competition. Simon & Schuster and Penguin and Random House tended to compete for the same types of authors, whereas the other publishers did not compete as much. Then the expert did some calculations and predicted that as a result of the merger, authors would lose anywhere from 4% to up to 20% of their advances going forward. Okay, so that's like the basic way that one shows that a merger is likely to be anti-competitive under American law, where one is focusing on labor markets rather than product markets. Generally, the courts and the agencies do take into account efficiencies. It's possible that a merger will produce economies of scale that allows the publishers to be more efficient, resulting in either higher wages to the workers or lower prices to the buyers or both. But in this particular case, the efficiency argument was not strong and was actually excluded by the court because it was not credible. The sort of consumer welfare standard that people sometimes invoke, sometimes litigants say, look, this merger will help consumers because if the publishers can pay their authors less, then that will result.
Great. So once again, thank you so much for this wonderful overview of the US system, which does have a lot of similarities and overlap with the European system. And I think it's a similar problem, a similar fight. And so really appreciate that perspective. And thank you for taking the time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Bye, everyone.
Okay, so we'll be taking a break now until, how long is it? Until 5. So short break. última fase, na última sessão do nosso workshop hoje, e é com muito prazer que convido aqui sim, a Sónia Moura, que é Senior Legal Officer da Concorrência em Portugal, e a Isabel Patrício, jornalista da ECO, e mais uma vez o Pedro Martins, que está aqui. Infelizmente, a Diana Brioso Gonçalves, como eu disse anteriormente, está a algures num aeroporto da Europa, esperando por um voo que nunca mais descola. Mas, enfim, vamos, apesar de tudo, ouvir com atenção este debate sobre questões de direitos do trabalho e direito de concorrência. Obrigado aos três por estarem aqui. Sim.
Bem, antes de mais, boa tarde. Obrigada pelo convite para estar aqui a moderar esta conversa. As introduções, as apresentações são feitas. Neste painel vamos falar exatamente sobre concorrência e sobre o mercado de trabalho. E começava por um enquadramento global, tendo em conta que temos aqui muitos alunos de gestão e economia que provavelmente vão ser líderes de empresas nos próximos anos. Começava pela ADC e perguntava-lhe, Sónia Moura, quando é que a ADC começou a olhar para o mercado de trabalho do ponto de vista da concorrência. Sei que a primeira decisão nesse sentido é relativamente recente, 2022, salvo erro.
É com muito gosto, julgo que me ouve, é com muito gosto que estou aqui e com todo o gosto também partilho a experiência que tenho na Autoridade da Concorrência e, de facto, no Gabinete de Estudos e Acompanhamento de Mercados, em 2020 começámos com a mentoria da doutora Ana Sofia Rodrigues, à data que era a nossa diretora e economista-chefe da Autoridade da Concorrência, hoje também membro do Conselho de Administração. De facto, começámos a explorar, de um ponto de vista mais formal, as relações nos mercados de trabalho. E, claramente, como o professor Eric Posner aqui trouxe, há um caso Silicon Valley de 2010, nos Estados Unidos, do outro lado do Atlântico, que realmente despertou também a curiosidade dos practitioners, não é? Das autoridades de concorrência. E, de facto, entre 2020 e 2021, redigimos um relatório, chamamos-lhe Issues Paper, sobre os mercados laborais, concorrência, política de concorrência e mercados laborais, em que, de forma, eu diria, sucinta, esquemática, identificámos primeiro a questão teórica, o que são, ou o que é que se pode entender por práticas anticoncorrenciais também nos mercados laborais e, de uma forma também elucidativa, identificámos vários casos, várias decisões que já tinham sido proferidas por autoridades da concorrência na União Europeia, designadamente França, designadamente Espanha, em que a análise de casos de cartéis envolve não apenas a fixação de preços, aqueles a que estamos mais habituados, mas também as repartições de mercado, mas também a eliminação, no fundo, da estratégia comercial entre as empresas através de se restringirem ou a angariar ou a contratar, portanto, a solicitar ou a contratar ativamente ou passivamente os trabalhadores umas das outras. E, de facto, descrevemos esse conjunto de casos, fomentámos também, em termos da literatura económica, à data de 2021, que já existiam, e demos esse sinal com este primeiro estudo. E, de facto, também em 2020 já tínhamos interposto providências cautelares numa primeira decisão, então, que veio a ser proferida já em 2022 e que tinha a ver com um press release que surgiu na altura, por volta da altura do Covid, mas estes press releases foram elaborados pela Associação dos Clubes de Futebol, portanto, dos empregadores dos jogadores de futebol, sinalizando de que todos os clubes de futebol acordavam em não contratar jogadores uns dos outros por razões de que tivessem motivado a rescisão dos contratos de trabalho por questões relacionadas com o Covid. Portanto, este anúncio foi público e daí que a Autoridade da Concorrência iniciou de forma oficiosa a análise do processo e identificou que, de facto, enquadrou como uma prática restritiva entre empresas concorrentes. Da concorrência, o nosso trabalho foi foi o culminar de marcar realmente a presença de que as decisões entre empresas em que restringem a compra de um input, seja esse input uma matéria-prima, seja este input do mercado de trabalho, são cartéis de compra. E, portanto, como cartéis de compra, eles são, no jargão do direito da União Europeia, e aplicável também em Portugal, são acordos por objeto e, portanto, não é necessário sequer demonstrar efeitos potenciais nos mercados e avançamos com a nossa decisão. O caso, neste momento, está no Tribunal de Justiça da União Europeia, está no Luxemburgo, para reenvio prejudicial. Porquê? Colocam-se questões, entre outras, a questão de saber se este tipo de acordos pode infringir por objeto o direito europeu, o artigo 101 do Tratado da União Europeia, mas também se colocam, por causa da especificidade do direito do desporto, algumas das matérias que podem considerar, designadamente se as matérias do desporto podem ou não fazer que a análise não fosse por esta via, fosse por outra, e designadamente se este género de acordos podem ser considerados cláusulas restritivas, acessórias e como tal justificadas. O entendimento da Autoridade da Concorrência é que não. Mas eu diria, é um caso muito interessante para seguirem. Quem tiver curiosidade é o caso Tondela. Já foram proferidas as conclusões do Advogado-Geral e estamos agora à espera do acórdão. Claramente que o acórdão devolve então essa interpretação jurídica para o Juiz Nacional e é o Juiz Nacional que decidirá. Portanto, eu diria aguardamos com alguma expectativa e de facto é um primeiro caso, este sim, o primeiro caso na Europa das NCAs, portanto das National Competition Authorities, as autoridades de concorrência, peço desculpa, de que foi standalone. O que eu quero dizer com este standalone é o naked no poach. Porquê? Porque todos os outros casos que eu citei na Europa, da Espanha, da França, eram casos que vinham acoplados a restrições geográficas, a fixação de preços de mercado. E o caso da Autoridade da Concorrência foi um caso que não tinha a questão de fixação de preços, ou seja, mais
era puramente laboral.
Puramente laboral. E claramente sinalizando é um acordo de cartel de compra. Damos até o exemplo da jurisprudência europeia, são os raw tobacco cases, que são casos de 2005 e 2006, em que é um cartéis de compra, na questão da aquisição do tabaco em rama para fazer depois os cigarros. Claramente são cartéis de compra e, portanto, não deve haver distinção quando tal prejudica a concorrência entre a aquisição do fator trabalho e da aquisição de um fator trabalho ou uma matéria-prima. Portanto, eu diria, foi o kick-off.
Certo.
Seguiram-se outras decisões?
Já lhe pergunto sobre as novas decisões, mas antes queria ouvir o professor Pedro Martins, até porque também foi, tem aí o microfone, secretário de Estado do Emprego, portanto queria lhe perguntar se as empresas estão suficientemente conscientes destas regras de consciência quando se fala do mercado de trabalho.
Boa tarde, mais uma vez. Obrigado a ambas por aceitarem também participar no nosso evento. Eu penso que a Autoridade da Concorrência tem feito um trabalho muito interessante nesta área. Tem feito um trabalho também com uma dimensão pedagógica muito significativa. Portanto, houve aqui um novo enquadramento, de alguma forma, houve uma nova atitude que foi divulgada junto das empresas com bastante antecedência. É um conjunto de documentos que estão disponíveis online, que foram divulgados junto de diferentes entidades durante bastantes anos, no sentido de criar um bom contexto para que pudéssemos em Portugal, nomeadamente junto às empresas, ter uma nova perspectiva em relação a esta matéria. Não é? Porque, como aliás o Eric Posner também estava a mencionar, para muitas empresas, de alguma forma, é natural ter uma perspectiva que nós consideraremos como anticoncorrencial em relação às questões do mercado de trabalho. Portanto, acho que é importante mudarmos a nossa perspectiva. Alguns dos resultados que apresentámos durante a tarde de hoje, penso que sublinham ainda mais, digamos assim, a relevância de adotarmos uma perspectiva mais equilibrada entre mercado de produto e mercado de trabalho. Mas, respondendo mais diretamente à sua pergunta, parece-me que ainda haverá aqui algum trabalho a fazer no sentido de assegurar que as empresas realmente estabelecem esta proporcionalidade. Portanto, eu receio que ainda... Enfim, identificando situações de não cumprimento da legislação aplicável, levando estas matérias junto dos tribunais, dando mais visibilidade às multas muito significativas que podem resultar destas situações. Haverá talvez aqui um trabalho complementar, que agora já poderá caber um pouco mais à dimensão, por exemplo, das universidades, que consiste em expor os efeitos negativos que a falta de concorrência no mercado de trabalho pode trazer, não só na dimensão económica, como noutras dimensões, e uma das apresentações de hoje foi sobre a dimensão da fecundidade. Portanto, poderá talvez, eventualmente, esta segunda dimensão até ser mais produtiva, não sei, estou a especular um pouco, não é? Mas, à medida que ganhamos uma maior consciência, realmente, dos vários efeitos negativos que podem resultar da falta de concorrência, com certeza, não é? Para além de todas as situações do foro judicial, chamemos-lhe assim, vamos talvez conseguir fazer aqui algumas mudanças importantes.
Sónia Moura, para comentar isto?
Sim, eu ia acrescentar, em complemento, claro. Quando a autoridade adotou este relatório em que explica as consequências negativas numa perspectiva económica e também salienta os perigos das empresas adotarem determinadas estratégias numa perspectiva legal, também emitiu um guia de boas práticas na prevenção dos acordos anticoncorrenciais. E, de facto, como o professor Pedro estava aqui a referir, a ADC tem desenvolvido campanhas de capacitação, de engagement, de advocacy, junto das empresas, das associações de empresas, mas junto, de facto, de vários stakeholders. Aliás, temos esta campanha de promoção de mais concorrência nos mercados laborais, que temos levado na campanha da ADC 20 anos, 20 cidades. Portanto, a autoridade, quando fez 20 anos, o Conselho de Administração comprometeu-se a visitar 20 cidades de Portugal, levando várias campanhas, divulgando o seu entendimento para prevenir, e em concreto, a campanha de prevenção de acordos anticoncorrenciais também é levada às empresas e é levada aos vários empregadores, possíveis empregadores. Uma dos slogans, eu diria, que transmitimos é de que imediatamente as empresas devem visualizar os acordos que têm in-house e devem visualizar se há alguma cláusula que possa constituir uma cláusula de não recrutamento ou de não solicitação, os no poach, ou de fixação de condições salariais, os wage fixing, e deve eliminá-la. Deve transmitir também aos seus recursos humanos, aos técnicos dos recursos humanos que fazem o recrutamento, e fazem o recrutamento muitas vezes junto de empresas de recrutamento, designadamente do trabalho temporário, muito importante, para terem essa percepção de que, junto da empresa de trabalho temporário, não deverão obter uma resposta, porque isso é um risco de lesar o direito à concorrência, não deverão ter uma resposta de sim, mas então, por exemplo, vários setores, setor da banca, setor de condução, setor de engenheiros, todos. Mas então há certos empregadores, ou candidatos de certos empregadores que não deverei recrutar. E, portanto, ao ouvir isto, significa que há um acordo entre que a empresa de recursos humanos, especializada em recursos humanos, designadamente, que está a ajudar no recrutamento, saberá. E, portanto, isso é um sinal também que ensinamos a dizer. Não se deve recusar um candidato de que empresa for, porque isso significa uma restrição laboral, e essa restrição laboral pode consubstanciar um no poach.
Isso é o lado mais pedagógico da ADC? É o lado
mais pedagógico da ADC e não apenas o sancionatório. E, portanto, é também uma questão de prevenção. É preferível a prevenção para o crescimento da economia, para ajudar o crescimento da economia, portanto, e também, de facto, capacitar as empresas também a comportarem-se de acordo com o direito à concorrência.
Mas voltando às sanções, agora há pouco estava a dizer que há novas decisões, além daquela de que já falamos, de 2022.
Sim.
Quantas decisões são essas? O que é que a ADC tem de novo para nos contar?
Na nossa página temos também temos publicitadas decisões que surgiram posteriormente. Aliás, é muito interessante relatar-vos que as decisões em concreto foram 3 transações, portanto, os settlements, ou seja, as empresas, uma vez notificadas da nota de ilicitude, efetuaram um acordo com a autoridade da concorrência para finalizar o procedimento da coima. Normalmente estas coimas beneficiam legalmente uma redução do montante da coima, mas, portanto, algumas destas, e no setor da consultoria tecnológica. E, portanto, há uma das empresas que não aceitou o acordo e recorreu da decisão, e, portanto, correrá no tribunal, mas tipicamente foram decisões posteriores, já em 2023, 2024 e uma de janeiro de 2025, todas no setor da consultoria tecnológica. E, portanto, eu diria, são setores e como é que lá chegámos a estes casos? É muito interessante que, quando a autoridade também efetua uma consulta pública do seu próprio relatório, o primeiro relatório de 2021, o relatório em que se sinalizava de forma, como referiu, pedagógica sobre os acordos no mercado de trabalho, tivemos algumas exposições a sinalizarem este ou este aspecto e no setor da tecnologia pedagógica. E, portanto, depois prosseguimos a instrução e a investigação e conseguimos depois construir estes casos. Portanto, isto significa que dentro de uma autoridade da concorrência existem várias sinergias. Muitas vezes, quando nós escutamos os stakeholders, é sempre positivo para beneficiarmos de estudos, por exemplo, para sinalizarmos, mas também por vezes podemos ter estas surpresas de que o mercado nos vem sinalizar, nos vem trazer indícios de que pode haver algo que não está a correr bem, uma perspectiva concorrencial, e também fazemos o nosso caminho, e assim esses casos surgiram. Eu diria, esses casos já foram adotados, temos neste momento já publicitados. Temos 2 comunicados de imprensa, já 2 press releases e, portanto, também já vos posso transmitir. Um é de junho de 2025, o outro é de setembro de 2025. São 2 novas notas de ilicitude, que aqui significa no termos do processo, ou seja, a Autoridade da Concorrência acusou 2 novos casos e, neste momento, está em fase de defesa das empresas visadas, que terão, claro, presunção de inocência, e terão a oportunidade também de trazer os seus argumentos e de defenderem de adotarem a sua posição. Que setores é que são? E, portanto, estão nos comunicados de imprensa no nosso site. Um deles foi detectado numa destas campanhas de advocacy, 20 anos, 20 cidades, em que a autoridade recebeu estes indícios e abriu depois oficiosamente. Um deles é uma cláusula de não angariação e recrutamento mútuo de empresas associadas de uma determinada associação, e que tem este código de ética na sua página e que tem a ver com o mercado de trabalho temporário. E, portanto, é muito interessante e esta informação já vos posso transmitir. Portanto, é de facto muito interessante. Vamos prosseguir agora, vamos aguardar a defesa e depois iremos prosseguir para a decisão. Portanto, de facto, esta cláusula estava neste código de ética há muitos anos já. Há muitos anos. Depois temos uma outra nota de... Vou só aqui consultar as minhas notas, para ser o mais informativa possível. Depois temos então uma outra nota de ilicitude, esta é de setembro de 2025, que é na indústria das bebidas. Portanto, foram também notificadas desta nota de ilicitude da Autoridade da Concorrência 3 empresas do setor das bebidas, mais também a sua sociedade-mãe, e, portanto, neste momento ainda não revelamos a identidade das empresas visadas. Certo. Mas, portanto, temos 2 setores, Associação de Setor do Emprego e dos Recursos Humanos, Empresas de Trabalho Temporário e Indústria das Bebidas.
Certo. Antes de passarmos ao nosso próximo tema, queria perguntar ao professor Pedro Martins qual é que é a importância da concorrência para a criação de empregos de qualidade e, por outro lado, em Portugal, tendo em conta que temos um tecido empresarial tão composto por microempresas, fala-se muito na necessidade da fusão dessas empresas, mas, por outro lado, isso parece que pode trazer problemas de emprego e de salários.
Penso que temos aqui um desafio relacionado com esse trade-off que está a mencionar, não é? Por um lado, precisamos de empresas com maior dimensão. Temos, aliás, uma associação muito ativa na defesa das empresas de maior dimensão e penso que fazem um trabalho também muito interessante a mostrar que empresas de maior dimensão, em geral, pagam remunerações mais elevadas, oferecem benefícios não financeiros mais generosos, um conjunto muito alargado de condições mais vantajosas que estão associadas à dimensão da empresa, por razões várias, por razões do próprio sucesso da empresa, que levou à capacidade da empresa de crescer mais. Portanto, há aqui um conjunto de situações que é positivo. Portanto, penso que em Portugal precisamos de mais empresas de maior dimensão. Agora, penso que poderá ser preocupante se isso resultar exclusivamente de um processo de fusão de empresas. Não digo, enfim, que seja contra esse tipo de situações, poderá haver vantagens várias, mas poderá, enfim, se houver esse enfoque muito grande na dimensão da fusão de empresas, poderemos realmente começar a ter alguns aspectos negativos associados à falta de alternativas para os trabalhadores. E Portugal tende a ser um país em que os trabalhadores mudam um pouco de empresa. Houve, aliás, um estudo recente apresentado no encontro dos bancos centrais europeus, em Sintra, que falava um bocado sobre esta temática, mostrando que pode ser uma das razões da falta de crescimento da Europa. Os trabalhadores, por razões várias, tendem a, enfim, permanecer muitos anos nas mesmas empresas, e cria-se aqui uma situação de falta de realocação de recursos, nomeadamente com uma falta de mobilidade de trabalhadores de empresas menos produtivas para empresas mais produtivas. Não é? Sabemos as restrições que temos na Europa em termos de de crescimento populacional, etc. Portanto, grande parte do nosso crescimento, pondo de lado as questões da imigração, grande parte do nosso crescimento poderá ter que vir, sobretudo, deste fenómeno da realocação. E isso implica que as empresas realmente estejam muito abertas a contratar de outras empresas do mesmo setor ou de setores diferentes. Portanto, neste sentido, passar esta mensagem a vários níveis, pelas autoridades de concorrência, pelos meios de comunicação social, pelas universidades, que podemos ter um problema sério ao nível da concorrência no mercado de trabalho, é algo que pode ser muito importante para que possamos começar a crescer mais e ter níveis remuneratórios também mais elevados.
Portanto, no eventual desenho de políticas de incentivo à fusão, é preciso ter também atenção aos efeitos no mercado de trabalho.
Sem dúvida, sem dúvida. Isto é uma área em que a Autoridade da Concorrência trabalha muito. Há, com certeza, benefícios, empresas que, de outra forma, têm uma dimensão muito pequena e poderão mesmo correr o risco de não sobreviver. Sabemos que também temos um problema associado a questões de sucessão nas lideranças das empresas, portanto, empresas pequenas, apresentou vários estudos que mostravam que quando há restrições ao nível da concorrência, a diferença entre produtividade e remunerações tende a aumentar muito, não é? O que é também, penso eu, fácil de entender. Portanto, temos essa questão da desigualdade que pode ser agravada neste contexto. Depois temos a questão da eficiência, que se calhar, usando aqui esta perspectiva um pouco mais estereotipada, poderá estar mais associada à direita e realmente, havendo estas restrições à realocação dos trabalhadores, a eficiência como um todo sai prejudicada. Portanto, espero que esta maior consciencialização em relação a esta temática possa talvez promover alinhamentos entre as diferentes forças políticas para que este tema ganhe mais atenção.
Sobre essa questão política, atual, apresentam hoje um estudo sobre a concorrência e a fecundidade no momento em que a reforma da Lei do Trabalho está em curso, nomeadamente no que diz respeito a licenças parentais. Que resultados é que, ou de que modo é que estes resultados poderiam de alguma forma ser incorporados nessa negociação e na reflexão sobre o Código do Trabalho?
Pronto, eu se calhar tenho aqui uma opinião um bocadinho pessoal sobre esta matéria. Temos um Código de Trabalho que já tem 560 artigos. A minha preferência, de alguma forma, é orientar a regulação das relações laborais, sobretudo ao nível setorial.
Da
negociação coletiva. Penso que já temos um Código de Trabalho suficientemente alargado, que já cobre demasiadas coisas. Penso que depois já tira espaço à própria contratação coletiva. Portanto, eu acho que devemos, se calhar, ou manter como está, ou até pensar em alguns ajustes para dar mais espaço à contratação coletiva. Tendo dito isto, penso que também temos que ganhar maior sensibilidade ao potencial de restrição da concorrência que pode resultar da própria contratação coletiva. A contratação coletiva, num dos seus aspectos mais importantes, inclui, no final dos contratos, uma tabela ou várias tabelas de cariz salarial. Que podem, talvez, é uma questão que penso que é interessante também numa perspectiva de investigação, talvez também numa perspectiva da Autoridade da Concorrência, criar aqui alguns pontos focais.
Uma concertação de preços, mas do trabalho...
Exato. Há aqui esta questão que eu penso que merece maior atenção. Portanto, a minha posição em relação à contratação coletiva é, de alguma forma, um pouco ambígua, porque, se por um lado... penso que é bom para o país descentralizarmos um pouco e não termos este enfoque tão esmagador no Código do Trabalho, não é? Como, aliás, se vê agora com as alterações e a reforma, etc. Mas, por outro lado, receio que possa haver aqui alguns aspectos negativos. Portanto, encontrar aqui um bom equilíbrio, penso que era muito bom para o país.
A ADC tem refletido sobre esta questão da negociação coletiva e das tabelas salariais?
Eu não vou fechar a pergunta. Não, só para não me esquecer. Eu gostaria só de tecer um comentário que uma das competências que a autoridade tem, de facto, é a avaliação concorrencial de políticas públicas e, portanto, temos sempre a oportunidade de, ou a convite dos membros do Governo ou dos membros da Assembleia da República, enfim, todos os que adotam legislação ou regulamentação, as entidades reguladoras setoriais, etc., mas para o caso, temos sempre a oportunidade, ou então, ex officio, nós próprios fazermos. E eu diria, é a título mesmo muito pessoal, mas na realidade tivemos a oportunidade de citar e de analisar nos trabalhos alguns alguns artigos do Código do Trabalho que mexem nas matérias, o artigo 136 a 138, portanto, que tem a ver com, por um lado, a sanção da nulidade, em que o próprio Código do Trabalho já prevê a nulidade de acordos entre os empregadores para se restringirem na contratação, portanto, o no poach, já está proibido, é uma sanção da nulidade, não tem depois uma consequência, eu diria, cível, e portanto, eventualmente, e é uma opinião muito pessoal, e por isso gostaria de deixar claro, poderia eventualmente ser revisitado, o que não significa que a competência contraordenacional da Autoridade da Concorrência não seja aquela que tem vindo a ser aplicada e, portanto, aplicar-se-á e os dois ordenamentos jurídicos podem se aplicar ao mesmo tempo. De facto, outra das matérias sobre as quais tivemos a oportunidade de também ir acompanhando, não formulando recomendações, e, portanto, uma vez mais é uma opinião pessoal, mas, de facto, num trabalho que fizemos, e penso que poderemos ter a oportunidade aqui de discorrer um pouco, que é as non-competes, ou seja, tal como os nossos keynotes falaram do outro lado do Atlântico, portanto, a sanção jurídica de cláusulas de não concorrência que são celebradas já não entre duas empresas empregadoras, mas entre o empregador e o empregado, numa relação de contrato de trabalho, as chamadas non-competes. Enquanto que nos Estados Unidos elas são consideradas per se ilícitas, no ordenamento jurídico europeu e no ordenamento jurídico nacional não são. Portanto, para deixar muito claro o que é que significa, o próprio Código do Trabalho permite esta margem de liberdade para haver essa negociação. Há uma razão de política pública que se entende, que é, muitas vezes, a proteção de algum know-how, designadamente alguma proteção que possa existir quando esse trabalhador leva um determinado know-how, pode abrir uma empresa imediatamente ao lado. Existem razões, e que nós discutimos num issues paper que fizemos sobre inteligência artificial generativa, e, portanto,
certo, já lá vamos, certo.
Mas só para dizer que as políticas públicas podem ser sempre avaliadas. Neste momento, Portugal tem um limite de 2, 3 anos destas cláusulas de não concorrência, são justificadas, elas têm sujeito a uma remuneração. Há sempre melhorias a fazer na legislação, designadamente, por exemplo, o quanto da remuneração estar determinado e não ter que depois ser determinável em tribunal. E eventualmente poderia até aligerar essa questão de contencioso. E, portanto, eu diria, há sempre melhorias a fazer na avaliação de políticas públicas e, de facto, para tornar os mercados mais... para haver mais mobilidade por parte dos trabalhadores, sem prejuízo de se reconhecer, e na Europa assim o entendemos, portanto, que as não-competes não são per se ilegais como nos Estados
Mas tem algum
Unidos.
comentário a fazer em relação à negociação coletiva e às tabelas salariais, certo?
Claro que sim, exatamente. Portanto, quanto à negociação coletiva, como é que, numa perspectiva de direito à concorrência, e que, aliás, também no relatório de 2021 a autoridade, de forma pedagógica, explicou, as convenções coletivas, elas estão excluídas quando os parceiros sociais, nas vestes de parceiros sociais e não noutras vestes. O que é que eu quero dizer com isto? Que é claro que os trabalhadores de um lado e os empregadores do outro, designadamente representados por sindicatos, quando todos nos seus papéis estão a discutir a sede de convenção coletiva, designadamente questões como uma harmonização de um teto máximo de um salário, não devem trocar informação sensível, estratégica e comercial de cada uma das empresas e de cada um deles. A informação deve ser limitada ao mínimo essencial para se alcançar de forma quase anomizada um valor de referência para o setor. E, portanto, a diferença é que isto é um contexto legítimo de convenção coletiva, o contexto ilegítimo de convenção coletiva é quando possam numa site talk, uma conversa ao lado, os empregadores terem trocado todas as folhas salariais, a sua perspectiva, quanto é que vamos, ninguém vai pagar mais, toda a gente, ninguém vai pagar mais e ninguém vai recrutar uns dos outros e, de facto, vamos aqui colocar barreiras enormes à mobilidade, vamos pôr um capo nos salários e, com isso, depois temos as consequências negativas na economia, que é designadamente ineficiência alocativa dos recursos, a produtividade desce, menos qualidade, menos escolha, menos incentivos à inovação. Portanto, eu diria... passar esta mensagem muito clara de que é positivo que exista convenções coletivas e, portanto, porque é muito importante também devolver este bargaining power aos trabalhadores, que é a outra perspectiva, que é os trabalhadores também devem poder exercer poder negocial junto do empregador, sobretudo em monopsónios, claro, como aqui falámos. Portanto, é exatamente a perspectiva de lhes devolver esse poder negocial. E, portanto...
Mas falava há pouco, e este é o nosso último tema, sobre o vosso paper da IA generativa, a concorrência e os mercados de trabalho, e queria perguntar-lhe que desafios é que essa tecnologia traz à avaliação das relações de trabalho numa perspectiva da concorrência.
De facto, eu diria a nível mundial. A nível mundial tem-se falado muito de como é que a IA pode ajudar os vários setores de atividade, e a inteligência artificial generativa é também uma especificidade do digital, e a Autoridade da Concorrência também publicou um primeiro relatório, julgo que em 2023, e depois, que também está disponível na nossa página, sobre os vários parâmetros que contribuem para que a IA generativa possa contribuir valor acrescentado para a economia. E depois publicámos, já vamos no terceiro short paper, se não me falha a memória, em que fomos dissecar, são documentos de facto mais pequenos, cerca de 10, 15 páginas, em que focamos em alguns aspectos. E um dos últimos, também tive a oportunidade de colaborar, tem a ver com os desafios os desafios que setores utilizam a IA generativa necessitam para a busca do talento. E aqui, uma vez mais, estamos a olhar para o input talento. Não é o input matéria-prima, é o input de talento. E, de facto, este é um dos setores em que está também, vários estudos identificam, a nível mundial, de que é necessário uma expertise especial. Portanto, não estamos só a falar de engenheiros do digital, nós estamos a falar de engenheiros que sabem correr modelos de inteligência artificial generativa. E, portanto, a existência de barreiras à mobilidade deste talento muito específico pode fazer, a consequência teórica, não é? Pode fazer com que não haja mais inovação, não hajam mais empresas a conseguir recrutar uns dos outros. Porquê? Porque todo o know-how de correr estes modelos também demora algum tempo a materializar-se. E, portanto, o nosso objetivo foi identificar que para a IA generativa é necessário talento, aplicando o conhecimento de estudos empíricos transversais. Sabíamos que poderiam haver estas indicações teóricas de que em mercados concentrados, de facto, poderia haver uma menor mobilidade. A autoridade quis aprofundar e efetuámos um questionário junto de 68 empresas, se não me falha a memória, com foco no digital, e fizemos algumas perguntas, como, por exemplo, perguntas de, existem, por exemplo, cláusulas de não concorrência, não compites nos contratos de trabalho, elas são lícitas, esse foi o meu primeiro disclaimer, elas são lícitas à luz do Código do Trabalho português, mas, a não ser que ultrapassem depois os limiares, é uma nuance jurídica, eu vou ter todo o gosto depois de partilhar convosco. Mas, portanto, fizemos perguntas de se estes contratos de trabalho têm cláusulas de confidencialidade. E sim, todos têm, justifica-se pela proteção do negócio, mas todos tinham. Mas depois todos têm non-compete, grande parte deles, eu diria, estou a dizer de cor, 40 e tal % deles têm. Nós temos isso no nosso issues paper, e eu trouxe-o aqui, portanto também posso recorrer aos dados só para ser também o mais informativa possível. E na realidade, perguntámos e, portanto, quisemos, de facto, percepcionar, e, portanto, os elementos eram, portanto, se os contratos de trabalho tinham cláusulas de não concorrência, se tinham as cláusulas de confidencialidade, se tinham cláusulas de reembolso de despesas de formação, por exemplo, porque muitas das vezes, e sim, as percentagens são elevadas. Portanto, sabendo, ao início, que estas cláusulas são lícitas, temos que percepcionar o seu impacto. Elas não deixam de ter um impacto na mobilidade. E por isso é que a revisitação de políticas públicas faz todo sentido percepcionarmos se, por exemplo, cláusulas de formação se justificam por 2 anos, se é preciso elas serem reembolsáveis, as cláusulas das non-compete se justificam por 2 anos, se podem deixar de existir, por exemplo, há jurisdições, e nós fizemos um benchmark aqui para este issues paper na IA generativa, e há de facto jurisdições que têm, por exemplo, nas non-competes, têm 1 ano para trabalhadores não especializados, 2 anos para trabalhadores especializados. Até há essa distinção. E há outras jurisdições que não têm. Portanto, de facto, e depois temos o exemplo paradigmático dos Estados Unidos, em que de facto essa posição é mais musculada. Não existe. E na IA generativa, o que percepcionamos é que alguns dos fundadores de novas empresas que surgiram da IA generativa eram ex-empregados, eram ex-empregados de outras empresas. E, portanto, se existisse essa non-compete, eles não teriam aberto uma nova empresa de IA generativa e, portanto, não teríamos mais pluralidade de produtos e se calhar tantas empresas, ainda assim estamos a falar de uma dezena, focadas na IA generativa. Portanto, eu diria, tivemos essa oportunidade de realmente percepcionar que questões que se colocam com a mobilidade dos trabalhadores são de facto transversais, quer na procura de skilled como de non-skilled trabalhadoras e de facto sem prejuízo do âmbito de políticas públicas poder-se avançar em várias matérias, também neste âmbito contraordenacional, mas também de preventivo, de advocacy, de passar as mensagens corretas, passamos. E portanto temos vindo a trabalhar e esse foi um dos últimos trabalhos que fizemos.
Vamos à última pergunta, professor Pedro Martins, agarrando aqui no que a ADC nos dizia sobre a IA generativa, de que modo, portanto, já ouvimos 2 papers sobre o impacto da concorrência na fecundidade e na produtividade, mas de que modo é que a mobilidade dos trabalhadores promovida por essa a concorrência pode promover a inovação ou, no inverso, atenuá-la com prejuízo para a economia nacional?
Mas, mais uma vez, é aqui um equilíbrio que se tem que estabelecer, não é? Por um lado, queremos permitir o aparecimento de novas ideias e novas empresas, portanto é necessário que os trabalhadores tenham a oportunidade de sair e não ter que esperar 2, 3 anos até poder criar o seu negócio. Por outro lado, é preciso dar incentivos às empresas para poderem investir no desenvolvimento destas novas áreas. Portanto, enfim, não sei dizer, se calhar, talvez com a evolução tecnológica, teremos que pensar em prazos mais curtos para estas restrições. Se calhar há 5, 10 anos atrás, um prazo de 2, 3 anos seria razoável. Agora, com a aceleração que temos vindo a assistir, se calhar será um prazo demasiado longo. Devemos pensar em prazos mais na ordem dos 6 meses, 12 meses, algo nesse sentido. Portanto, poderá haver aqui algum potencial de ajustamento de alguma legislação no sentido de facilitar a maior mobilidade.
Em linha também com a velocidade da própria tecnologia, mas...
Sim, eu também queria só deixar aqui uma nota que também temos vindo a abordar, que é, por vezes encontramos muita justificação de que temos que os acordos no poach servirão para poupar dinheiro nos salários e, portanto, que isso depois se pode repercutir em produtos finais mais baratos. E a Autoridade da Concorrência pronunciou-se no Issues Paper, logo em 2021, no sentido de dizer, bom, em termos... se olharmos para os salários como custos fixos e se olharmos para os trabalhadores com os contratos de trabalho por conta de outrem, muito dificilmente esta alegação se verificará. E, portanto, ou seja, não é justificável. A questão de pagarmos menos nos salários, claramente não se vai repercutir em preços de produtos mais baratos. Certo. E, portanto, também deixar isso claro e dizer que, de facto, as empresas têm à sua disposição outras estratégias. E as estratégias são designadamente de motivar os seus trabalhadores, não tem necessariamente que passar por, eventualmente, salários mais altos. E isso pode servir com outro tipo de condições de promoção, de formação interna, outro tipo de condições salariais que, por vezes, não são férias, de dias, etc., para a família. Portanto, outras questões que as políticas públicas, que não é a política da autoridade de concorrência, mas claramente esta proporcionalidade, desenvolvimento económico, garantir também o investimento das empresas, por outro lado também ter políticas sociais mais equitativas. Portanto, é este justo equilíbrio que o decisor público tem a missão. No lado da Autoridade da Concorrência, se calhar é mais fácil, só temos que olhar para a política pública de concorrência. O decisor público, o legislador, tem a parte mais difícil, que é conciliar tudo. E, portanto, eu diria, o nosso papel é mais fácil.
Pergunto só à audiência se há alguma questão que queiram colocar. Claro.
Obrigado. Muito obrigado. Eu se calhar fazia um comentário e depois fazia um comentário pegando nas palavras do Pedro Martins e também aproveitando o facto de estarmos aqui no contexto de um instituto que tenta fazer esta ponte entre a academia e a investigação científica e depois a política pública, que eu acho que é fundamental. E é fundamental por causa disto, ou seja, há aqui temas que vão surgindo nas agendas de autoridades de concorrência que visam precisamente dar uma resposta a gaps de enforcement que se vão identificando. E esses gaps de enforcement muitas vezes são identificados precisamente na investigação académica. E este tema do mercado de trabalho é precisamente um desses temas em que se foi identificando um gap de enforcement. Há outros temas, aliás, se calhar só deixar aqui a nota que neste momento, um bocadinho na sequência do relatório Porter, que identificou um gap de enforcement, neste caso um gap de produtividade entre a Europa e os outros blocos, em particular os Estados Unidos, a Comissão Europeia neste momento está a rever as linhas de orientação, as suas guidelines para análise de operações de concentração, para tentar trazer para a discussão, no âmbito, neste contexto de análise de uma operação de concentração, temas tão variados como é que a operação de concentração pode impactar na eficiência dinâmica da economia, na inovação e no desenvolvimento, temas como questões ambientais e temas também como o mercado de trabalho, portanto. E isto surgiu um bocadinho também porque a academia, e hoje tivemos aqui várias referências e vários papers empíricos, quer para a experiência americana, quer também para a experiência portuguesa, identificou este gap de enforcement. E, no fundo, discutiram-se aqui dois temas que me parecem relevantes. Quer dizer, eu acho que é importante nós percebermos em que medida é que o direito da concorrência relacionado com este tema do poder de mercado do lado dos empregadores impacta na produtividade da economia e depois, num segundo momento, em que medida é que isto pode impactar no pass-through de variações na produtividade, como é que elas se refletem nos salários. E, portanto, queria só fazer este comentário mais geral e dar os parabéns para as pessoas que têm dinamizado este Instituto de Política, porque me parece fundamental. A minha pergunta para os dois, portanto, tentando ter aqui uma visão mais de economista e uma visão mais de jurista, tem a ver com o seguinte. É verdade que as autoridades e a Autoridade de Concorrência Portuguesa têm feito um trabalho, há uns anos a esta parte, a esse nível, têm trazido os temas do mercado de trabalho para o centro das preocupações quando se fala do antitrust, e a Sónia falou aqui de vários casos que já foram, no fundo, levados, no fundo já houve decisões e há outras que provavelmente estarão na calha. Do lado das concentrações não tem sido tanto assim ainda. Minha expectativa, enquanto estando envolvido na análise de operações de concentração, é que um dia possamos vir a ter casos de mercado de trabalho também do lado das concentrações, mas do lado das concentrações nós defrontamos aqui com um problema que, aliás, o professor Érico Posner referiu na sua intervenção, que é o seguinte: há uma tendência para as autoridades de concorrência, sobretudo quando analisam operações de concentração, olharem para isso sempre numa perspectiva de o bem-estar do consumidor. Aliás, a lei refere que a promoção da concorrência é importante porque ela impacta nos consumidores intermédios ou nos consumidores finais. Portanto, sempre pensando no mercado do produto e sempre pensando, na perspectiva dos consumidores. E, portanto, nas discussões que nós vamos tendo e na discussão que está neste momento a decorrer também na Comissão Europeia, nesta revisão das linhas de orientação, há um bocadinho esta discussão, ou seja, se eu conseguir identificar que uma determinada operação de concentração tem impacto no mercado de trabalho, ok? Eu vou ter que fazer o passo seguinte ou não. Ou seja, demonstrar que o impacto que esta operação tem em salários mais baixos, em menos emprego, etc., no mercado de trabalho, vai também ter impactos no mercado ajusante. Portanto, vou ter que fazer este passo adicional ou basta-me demonstrar que há aqui um impacto no mercado. Érico Posner referiu isso também, que é, bem, os mais baixos, portanto, vou ter custos mais baixos. Érico Posner referiu isso também, que é, bem, os mais baixos, portanto, vou ter custos mais baixos e, no limite, estes custos mais baixos podem-se refletir também em preços mais baixos, beneficiando o consumidor.
Obrigada.
E, portanto, era esta a minha questão.
Eu pedia poder de síntese aos dois, 1 minuto para cada um para responder a esta questão. Não sei se a Sónia Moura quererá começar a responder ou se o professor Pedro Martins.
Eu posso responder. Obrigada. Eu acho que a pergunta é muito interessante. Eu não tenho resposta para ela. E a pergunta, eu diria, a pergunta é muito interessante e está muitíssimo bem colocada, mesmo em termos temporais. Aliás, como o Paulo Gonçalves bem referiu, neste momento a própria Comissão Europeia está a analisar, está a rever, tem este espaço de consulta, como a Autoridade da Concorrência, juntamente às outras autoridades de concorrência, tem a oportunidade de comentar, de dar os seus contributos, mas eu diria, em termos legais, quer o Regulamento Europeu, que é o 139 de 2004, que era a Lei da Concorrência Nacional, e é a minha opinião pessoal, e o Paulo Gonçalves será também master na aplicação deste quadro legal. Neste momento, estes 22 anos de análise de operações de concentração não envolviam taxativamente, formalmente, nenhuma desta dimensão, a dimensão sobre os trabalhadores. Portanto, eu diria o quadro legal, neste momento vigente, não há decisão nenhuma que tenha esta análise. Tal não significa que essas matérias venham a evoluir e que possamos convergir para análise dessa matéria. Portanto, eu diria, ultrapassa as minhas competências, a minha área de expertise, a autoridade não se pronunciou sobre este tipo de matérias e, no meu conhecimento, não há decisão que aborde essa questão dos trabalhadores neste momento.
Professora, uma última nota.
Exatamente, ainda. Mas são, de facto, por isso é que eu digo, matérias mesmo muito temporais.
Certo.
Muito temporais.
Uma última nota.
A minha perspectiva sobre estas questões é sempre muito empírica. Começo logo a pensar como é que isto consegue fazer em termos quantitativos, com bases de dados, etc. Se eu percebi bem a pergunta, portanto, passa muito por este potencial trade-off, no sentido em que os trabalhadores poderão ser prejudicados, mas os consumidores poderão ser beneficiados na medida em que há ganhos de custos que podem levar a preços mais baixos. Eu penso que já temos algumas ferramentas para olhar para, por exemplo, operações de concentração que tenham tido lugar no passado e criar alguns resultados nesta lógica de avaliação de políticas e de produção de resultados que possam orientar as políticas públicas para perceber como é que estes duas componentes se comparam. Em que medida é que eventuais prejuízos junto dos trabalhadores têm uma escala completamente diferente das vantagens ao nível de preços mais baixos junto dos consumidores. Portanto, é a resposta que eu consigo dar. Penso que há condições objetivas para analisar este tipo de situações, para depois poder quantificar um bocado melhor estes trade-offs, porque realmente parece-me que pode haver perspectivas positivas também junto dos consumidores, que devem ser reconhecidas.
Muito bem.
Muito
muito obrigada aos dois e obrigada mais uma vez pelo convite para estar aqui presente. Foi um gosto. Obrigada.
Pois, então, muito obrigado a todos pela presença, pela participação. Este foi um trabalho de muitas pessoas durante muitas semanas, se não muitos meses. Um cumprimento especial ao nosso parceiro nesta atividade, a Equal Nova Era. É uma cátedra que temos na nova SBE, liderada pela professora Adeline de Lavande, e cujo grande tema de atenção é a temática da desigualdade. Portanto, claramente, por tudo aquilo que falámos ao longo desta tarde, a temática da desigualdade está muito relacionada com a temática do poder de mercado de trabalho dos empregadores. Penso que foi uma discussão muito rica, espero que tenham gostado, estejam sempre à vontade para voltar à nova SBE e, em particular, ao Instituto de Políticas Públicas, para discutir este tipo de temas. Muito obrigado a todos, um resto de bom dia.